A stallion that had already put 2 men in the hospital, a trainer with 15 years of an unbroken record, and a ranch where nobody wanted to admit that the real problem wasn't the horse. Obsidian didn't hate people. He was afraid of them. And there is nothing more dangerous in this world than 1,000 pounds of raw terror with nowhere left to run. This is the story of what happens when one man chooses patience over pride, and one woman finally gets heard after a lifetime of silence. Hit like, drop a comment with your city, and let's see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The thing about Blackridge Ranch was that it looked peaceful from the highway. You drive past it on Route 9 heading out of Cutter's Bluff, and if you caught it at the right hour, that late golden hour when the sun dropped behind the Cimarron ridgeline and painted everything amber and rust, you'd think it was a postcard. 300 acres of rolling pasture land, white fence posts marching in long, clean rows, a red barn big enough to stable 20 horses, a stone house sitting back from the road with cottonwood trees on either side that were probably older than the county itself. You'd think, now there's a place where life makes sense. You'd be wrong. By the time Silas Mercer turned his dusty Ford pickup off Route 9 and through the iron gate that bore the Blackridge brand, a simple BR burned into a cast iron plate, the late afternoon air already had an edge to it that had nothing to do with the wind coming off the plains. He'd driven nearly 400 miles from a quarter-horse operation outside of Amarillo, and his back ached in the way it always did after too many hours behind the wheel. He was 41 years old, not old by any reasonable measure, but old enough to feel 400 miles in places he didn't used to feel anything. He rolled down the truck window and let the Oklahoma evening air push through the cab. Dry grass, cattle somewhere nearby, and underneath that, something else. The particular smell of a working ranch that was also somehow a place under strain. Silas had been to enough ranches in enough states to know the difference. It wasn't a smell exactly. More like an atmosphere. A pressure in the air the way you feel before a thunderstorm when the sky hasn't changed yet, but every animal knows it's coming. He followed the gravel drive past the main barn and pulled up near a row of wooden hitching posts that nobody seemed to use anymore. Before he'd even killed the engine, a man was walking toward him from the direction of the main house. Walking fast, the way men walk when they've been waiting and don't want to admit how long. Holt Calder was 63 years old and looked like the kind of man who'd been weathered down to only the essential parts. He was lean in the way that comes from decades of physical work rather than any deliberate effort, with a face that the sun had tanned to the color of old leather and deep-cut lines around his eyes and mouth that suggested he squinted into the wind often and smiled infrequently. He wore a gray canvas work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and boots that had been resoled at least twice. His handshake when he reached Silas was immediate and firm. The handshake of a man who believes a handshake tells you everything you need to know. Mercer. Not a question. A statement. Mr. Calder. Silas climbed out of the truck and felt his spine do that particular thing it did after long drives, like a stack of loose plates shifting. He kept his expression neutral. Long drive, Holt said, looking at Silas the way ranchers look at horses they're considering buying, sizing up the build, the stance, the eyes. Long enough. Silas looked past the man toward the main barn. Your Stallion's still on the property. Still on the property, Holt said, with a weight to the words that made Silas turn back to look at him. What's left of the round pen is out past the east barn. I'll take you. What's left of the round pen? Silas filed that away and followed without comment. They walked around the east side of the main barn, past a paddock where 3/4 horses watched them with mild and curious eyes, and through a narrow gap between 2 feed storage buildings that opened into a larger yard behind the working facilities. That was where Silas stopped walking. The round pen was built from heavy steel panels, the kind that cost real money, the 16-gauge livestock panels that were supposed to handle anything. 2 of the panels on the far side were bent outward in a way that made them look like something had hit them from the inside with substantial force. One of the top rails on the gate section had been sheared clean off. There were deep churning marks in the dirt that suggested a large animal had spent considerable time in sustained panic. Standing in the center of that damaged pen, watching them approach with the absolute stillness of an animal that has decided motion will only make things worse, was Obsidian. Silas had seen a lot of horses. He'd been working with horses since he was 16 years old, starting at a cutting horse operation in the Texas Panhandle, where he'd cleaned stalls for room and board and watched and learned everything he could from a man named Del Pritchard, who had the gift. Over 25 years, Silas had worked with horses in 7 states, had taken on animals that other trainers had given up on, had developed a reputation that brought him calls from serious operations when they had a serious problem. He'd never once failed to reach an animal, though he'd had a few that took far longer than anyone expected. None of that prepared him for Obsidian in any way that he could have explained. The horse was extraordinary. There was no other word for it. He stood close to 17 hands, jet black without a single white marking anywhere on his body. Black the way darkness is black, absolute and total. His conformation was close to perfect. The deep chest, the long sloping shoulder, the strong hindquarters that spoke of a bloodline carefully built over generations. He had a refined head with a broad forehead and large dark eyes that were, right now, showing a thin rim of white around the edges. Those eyes tracked Silas the moment he appeared. Not Holt, not the fence. Silas. He's beautiful, Silas said quietly. He's dangerous, Holt said, and there was nothing romantic about the way he said it. Pure statement of fact. Put one hand in the hospital in February. Ranch hand named Cutter, 8 years with us. Broke 2 ribs in his collarbone. Second handler we brought in from up near Enid. The horse pinned him against the rail before we could get the gate open. That man doesn't work with horses anymore. Silas kept his eyes on the Stallion. What happened before February? Holt was quiet for a moment. What do you mean? I mean, what happened to him before February? Before Cutter? Before any of your people went into the pen? Silas finally turned to look at the rancher. He wasn't born like this. Something shifted in Holt Calder's expression, a quick tightening, like a man who doesn't appreciate the direction a conversation is heading. He was transported from a breeding operation in Kentucky last fall, 18-hour haul. How was the transport done? I don't know the details. I wasn't there. I paid for it. Holt's voice had a finality to it that said, that's enough of that subject. Silas turned back to the horse. Obsidian had not moved, had barely blinked. But one thing had changed since Silas first looked at him. The thin rim of white around those dark eyes had gotten slightly thinner. Not gone, but less. What happened during the transport is most likely the whole story, Silas said, not accusatorially, just like he was reading something aloud. Animals that go through traumatic experiences during transport often. Mercer. Holt's voice was flat. I didn't bring you here to theorize. I brought you here because you have a reputation for results. I have a breeding season that I've already missed 1/4 of, a stallion that I paid $400,000 for, and a crew that is ready to call this animal a loss. I need him workable. I need him calm. And I need it done in a time frame that doesn't bankrupt me in the process. He paused. Can you do that or not? Silas looked at the horse for another long moment. Obsidian was watching him back. I can do it, Silas said, but I'm going to need you to keep your ranch hands out of this pen and away from this horse except when I'm present. And I'm going to need your patience, which I understand is probably the harder ask. Holt Calder looked at him for a long moment. Then, without warmth, but without hostility, he stuck out his hand again. They shook. The bunkhouse at Blackridge Ranch was clean in the Spartan way of places built for function with no opinion about comfort. Silas had a room to himself at the end of the building. A narrow bed, a wooden dresser with a drawer that stuck, and a window that looked out over the eastern pasture. He sat on the edge of the bed that first night with his boots still on, looking at the ceiling, and went through what he'd observed. The horse's fear response when Silas had approached the pen, not rage, not aggression as the primary impulse, but fear that had learned to look like aggression. That was the crucial thing. A truly aggressive animal moves differently. It comes at you with intent. What Silas had seen from Obsidian was an animal whose nervous system had been so overwhelmed by something it couldn't process that it had locked into a constant state of defensive panic. Every movement was threat. Every person was danger. Every enclosed space was a trap. He'd seen it before. Not often, but he'd seen it. The hard part wasn't reaching the horse. The hard part was doing it slowly enough that the horse's nervous system could actually rewire itself, which took time that men like Holt Calder didn't think they had. Silas unlaced his boots, set them beside the bed, and lay back fully clothed. Through the bunkhouse wall, he could hear the murmur of the other hands in the common room. A television, low voices, someone laughing at something. He stared at the ceiling and thought about the horse's eyes. He'd looked at me and gotten a little less afraid. It was small, barely measurable, but it was there. He was asleep before 9. He was up before 5, before anyone else in the bunkhouse stirred, and he walked out into the pre-dawn dark with a cup of coffee and a thermos and his thoughts still half in the fog of sleep. The eastern sky was just beginning to pale at the edges, the first suggestion of light without any actual light yet, and the ranch was completely quiet, except for the distant sound of cattle and the occasional restless movement from the main barn. Silas didn't go to the round pen. He pulled a wooden sawhorse from beside the feed building and dragged it to a spot roughly 30 feet from the round pen's gate, where the horse would be able to see him clearly without feeling directly approached. He sat on the sawhorse, poured coffee into the thermos lid, and drank it in small sips. Inside the pen, Obsidian was already watching him. Silas did nothing, said nothing, moved as little as possible. He drank his coffee and let the morning come in slowly and watched the horse watch him with the patience of a man who understood that patience wasn't passive. It was its own kind of action. 40 minutes passed. Obsidian took 2 steps toward the gate, stopped, held the position for a long time. Then, slowly, his head dropped. Not all the way down, not relaxed grazing position, but lower than it had been. A fraction of an inch of tension leaving the massive neck and shoulder muscles. Silas exhaled slowly through his nose and poured more coffee. He was still sitting there when, an hour later, he heard footsteps approaching behind him, lighter than a ranch hand's boots, more careful, like someone trying not to disturb something. He didn't turn around immediately. He waited until he heard the person stop, and then he turned slowly, keeping his movements easy and unhurried. The young woman, standing about 15 feet back from him, was perhaps 26, 27. She was Holt Calder's height, but her coloring was entirely different. Dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, olive skin, eyes that were a dark gray-green that Silas had never quite seen that color before. She was wearing work clothes, worn jeans, a faded blue flannel, boots that had seen serious use. She had a coffee mug of her own in both hands, and she was watching Obsidian, not Silas, with an expression of such specific, calibrated attention that it stopped him for a moment. She knew something about this horse. He could see it in the quality of her attention. "You're the daughter," Silas said, keeping his voice low. She switched her gaze to him with the composure of someone who'd been aware she might be noticed. "Naomi," she said. Her voice was quieter than her father's, but more deliberate. "You sat there for over an hour without going near him." "I did. The last handler they brought in went straight to the gate on day 1. A pause. "Before that, Cutter went in with a training stick on day 1. How'd those approaches work out?" Naomi looked at him for a moment with those gray-green eyes in a way that felt like she was deciding something. "Cutter has plates in his collarbone now." "I know," Silas said. "Your father told me." She looked back at the horse. Obsidian had noticed her arrival and his head had come back up, but he wasn't showing whites anymore. He was watching her with a quality of attention that was different from how he'd been watching Silas. Less defensive, more known. Silas filed that away too. "You've spent time with him," Silas said. It wasn't a question. Naomi wrapped both hands tighter around her mug. "I've tried to. From outside the pen. My father doesn't want me near him." A beat. "My father doesn't want me near most things, if we're being accurate." There was something dry in her voice when she said it, not bitter exactly, but worn. The tone of someone who has made peace with a frustration by refusing to be surprised by it anymore. "What have you noticed?" Silas asked. "About the horse." She looked at him again, this time with something different in her expression, like she was checking whether the question was genuine or polite. "He's worse in the mornings," she said, when she'd apparently decided it was genuine. "The first 2 hours after dawn. Something about that light maybe, or maybe it's that the transport happened early morning. I don't know. He's also worse when more than 2 people are near the pen at the same time. And he has a specific response to ropes. Anything that moves like a rope in his peripheral vision, and he's gone." She paused. "That's what set Cutter off. Cutter went in with a lead rope in his hand." Silas turned to look at her fully. She was still watching the horse. Did you tell your father that? About the rope? Yes. And? He said Cutter had been working with horses for 15 years, and he didn't need a girl telling him how to hold his equipment. There was no anger in how she said it, just the flat documentation of a fact. Silas turned back to Obsidian. The stallion had dropped his head again, slightly, a fraction. The mornings, Silas said quietly. The ropes. What else? Naomi sat down on the ground about 6 feet from the sawhorse, crossing her legs and held her mug between her palms, and she told him. The ranch hands at Blackridge were called, variously, Deke, Torrance, Phil, and a young man everyone called Junior, whose real name Silas learned only much later, was Gerald. They ranged in age from Junior's probable 22 to Deke's battered 50-something, and they shared, as ranch hands at a working operation often do, a collective professional culture with its own rules, its own hierarchy, its own sense of what was acceptable and what was embarrassing. Silas had been around enough to know how to read these cultures quickly. At Blackridge, the consensus on Obsidian was clearly established. The horse was dangerous, the horse was possibly unredeemable, and any approach that didn't involve establishing firm dominance fast was a waste of time that a real horseman wouldn't need. That was the baseline. He got his first real taste of it at breakfast the second morning in the ranch hand's kitchen, a long, narrow room off the bunkhouse common area with a gas range and a table that could seat 8 if everyone didn't mind their elbows. Deke was at the range when Silas came in, scrambling eggs with the mechanical efficiency of a man who has cooked the same breakfast so many times it requires zero attention. Torrance and Phil were at the table with coffee. Junior was doing something with his phone in the corner. "How was the horse this morning?" Torrance asked. He was in his mid-30s, compact and broad-shouldered, with a manner that was friendly on the surface and competitive underneath. "You go in the pen yet?" "Not yet," Silas said, finding a mug and pouring coffee. A brief silence, the kind that has content in it. "Not yet," Deke repeated from the range, not turning around. Day 2. Day 2, Silas confirmed. Mercer. Deke set the spatula down and turned. He wasn't hostile exactly. He was in the register that was one step removed from hostile, which was skeptical. "I've been working horses going on 30 years. What you're doing out there, sitting on a sawbuck drinking coffee, that's not training, that's waiting." "Sometimes waiting is training," Silas said. He kept his voice easy, without edge. He'd had this conversation before, in various forms, in various kitchens, on various ranches. "Depends on what the horse needs." "That horse needs to know who's in charge," Phil said from the table. Phil was the quietest of the four, and the one who seemed most aligned with Deke's views. "Right now he doesn't have a leader, that's the problem." "He's terrified," Silas said. "When an animal is in a state of active fear, it can't learn anything, can't take information in. The part of its nervous system that does learning is completely offline." He poured his coffee. "What you get from forcing a terrified animal is an animal that complies while you're present and looks for any opportunity to not comply when you're not, or an animal that escalates." He looked at Deke. "Which is what you've had." Deke held his gaze for a moment, then turned back to the eggs. "I've seen what patience gets you with a horse like that," Torrance said, with the confidence of a man who hasn't actually seen that. "He's just decided it. Gets you a horse that walks all over you." "And I've seen what force gets you," Silas said mildly. "Gets you a man with plates in his collarbone." The kitchen went quiet. Deke's spatula scraped the pan. Junior looked up from his phone and then back down again. Torrance's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. Silas took his coffee and went to find a place at the far end of the table, and the subject changed to something about a water pump in the north pasture that needed attention, and Silas let the conversation flow around him and ate breakfast, and thought about ropes and morning light and the information Naomi Calder had given him for free the day before. The first week proceeded in a way that anyone watching from the outside would have found deeply underwhelming. Silas spent the first 3 mornings on the sawhorse, at different distances, simply being present. He varied how long he stayed, sometimes an hour, sometimes 3. He varied the time of day, cycling through morning, midday, and late afternoon. He noted Naomi's observation about the early morning sensitivity and worked around it rather than through it, approaching the pen later on those days when Obsidian's tension was already visible from 20 feet. He did not enter the pen during that first week. He did not use a lead rope in any proximity to the pen during the first week. He did not raise his voice, make sudden movements, or allow more than one other person near the pen while he was working. What he did do was talk. Low, steady, unhurried. Not to communicate anything in particular. Horses don't understand English. A fact that is obvious and somehow constantly forgotten by people who want horses to understand English. He talked because the consistent rhythm of a calm human voice is a sensory signal, and Obsidian's nervous system was slowly, achingly slowly, learning to associate Silas's presence with the absence of anything bad happening. By the end of the first week, Obsidian would approach the gate side of the pen and stand there when Silas was at the sawhorse. Not close, not relaxed, but oriented toward him rather than away. Silas counted that as substantial. The ranch hands did not count it as substantial. "A week," Torrance said on Friday evening, leaning against the fence near the east barn. He wasn't talking to Silas directly. He was talking to Junior, which was a way of talking to Silas without having to be accountable for it. "A week and we haven't seen him go in the pen once." Junior, who was young enough to be genuinely uncertain what he was supposed to think, just nodded. "It takes as long as it takes," Silas said from where he was coiling a piece of water hose he'd been moving away from the area near the round pen. Anything rope-like, anything that moved with a snaking motion, he'd been systematically removing from Obsidian's line of sight. Rushing a traumatized horse doesn't save time. It costs time. Every setback resets the clock. "Traumatized," Torrance said, with a particular inflection that made the word sound like something Silas had made up. "That is what's happening," Silas said. "That's not a soft word. It's a clinical description. His nervous system took a significant shock during the transport, and it never had a chance to come down from it because every handling attempt after that added to the load instead of reducing it." He set down the hose. "What you had wasn't a bad horse. You had a horse in a permanent state of emergency." Torrance looked at him for a moment and then spat in the dirt. In that way men sometimes do when they don't have a response but need to put something in the space where one would go. He walked off toward the main barn. Junior watched him go, then looked at Silas with an expression that was almost apologetic. "He's not wrong that there's pressure," Junior said, which was the most diplomatically useful thing Junior had said in Silas's presence. "Mr. Calder's losing money on the breeding contracts. It's not... Nobody's just being impatient for no reason." "I know," Silas said. "I get it." He looked at the round pen where Obsidian stood in the long shadows of early evening. "Tell me something. You been here long?" 3 years. "You were here when the horse arrived last fall?" Junior's expression did something complicated. "Yeah." "How was he when he came off the trailer?" Junior was quiet for a moment. He looked down at his boots. "Bad," he said finally. "I mean, he was real bad. He came off the trailer and he was already... You could see. His eyes were bloodshot. He was sweat-soaked and the salt had dried on him. He was shaking." He paused. "I remember thinking somebody needed to just put him in a quiet stall and leave him alone for a week, you know? What happened instead?" "Cutter went in with a halter the same afternoon." Silas looked at the horse for a long moment. "There's the story," he said quietly. Junior nodded, looking like the weight of that fact had been sitting on him for a while. "Naomi came to watch Silas work most mornings, and most mornings, if there was no one else around, she would drift over to where he was, and they would stand or sit in a quiet parallel way, watching the horse together. And sometimes they talked, and sometimes they didn't. She wasn't easy to know, that was the honest way to put it. She was warm in a guarded way. The warmth was real. You could feel it in small moments, but it was surrounded by a perimeter of reserve that Silas respected because he recognized it. It was the reserve of someone who had learned that sharing observations gets you told you're wrong by people who didn't bother to look. She'd grown up on this ranch, went to the state agricultural college for 2 years before her mother's illness had brought her back, and she'd stayed because her father needed the help and then needed the help more. And then it became the kind of arrangement that nobody explicitly decided, but everyone implicitly understood. She ran the books. She handled the veterinary scheduling, the feed orders, the relationship with the farrier. She knew the conditions of every water tank on the property and the health status of every animal. She also knew horses in a way that had never been formally acknowledged, Because her father operated on the assumption that ranch knowledge flowed through the hired hands and the men of the family, not the daughter who kept the accounts. "He's responding to your rhythm," Naomi said one morning, on day 9, watching Obsidian from their usual distance. "The way you breathe. You slow your breathing down when you approach, and he can read it." "They read everything," Silas said, "more than most people credit them with. My father thinks horses respond to firmness." She said it neutrally, like she was making an observation about weather patterns. Firmness means different things. Silas watched the horse. There's firmness that comes from calm. There's firmness that comes from anxiety that's being held down. An animal can tell the difference. A prey animal especially. They've evolved over millions of years to read predator states. They know when something's scared of them. They know when it isn't. He paused. The firmness your ranch hands were bringing to this pen was anxiety pretending to be authority. The horse read it clearly. Naomi considered that. "He reads you differently." "What do you read?" She looked at him sidelong. "I'm not sure yet." It wasn't coy. It was honest in the particular way that honest people are sometimes mistaken for being evasive. She wasn't sure yet, so she said she wasn't sure yet. Silas found he appreciated that more than a polished answer would have given him. "The transport," Silas said, returning to the horse. "You have any sense of what exactly happened? Your father said he doesn't know the details." "He doesn't." Naomi was quiet for a moment. "But I talked to the vet who examined Obsidian when he arrived. Dr. Haverford, out of Cutter's Bluff." She paused. "She found bruising on his flanks, but both sides, symmetrical. The pattern was consistent with him being wedged against the transport partition and having it shift repeatedly during the haul. Like the partition wasn't secured properly and it kept impacting him every time the trailer moved." Silas absorbed that. 18 hours. 18 hours, Naomi confirmed. And he couldn't move away from it. Couldn't do anything except stand there and have it happen to him, again and again. She paused. That's what enclosed spaces mean to him now. That's what being restrained means. That's what any kind of pressure on his sides. That's why the training stick set him off, Silas said quietly, even before Cutter touched him with it. Even the presence of it. That's what I told my father. And Naomi smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was a smile that had given up expecting a different outcome. He told me Dr. Haverford was just covering herself legally, and that the horse was worth too much to have arrived damaged, so it couldn't be that bad. Silas rubbed the back of his neck. He had a long habit of not saying what he thought about how other people ran their operations, because unsolicited opinions were the fastest way to lose access to a horse that needed you. But he held it in with more effort than usual. The transport information helps me, he said. Changes what I do next. Specifically? He looked at her. You want to know the specifics. I've been studying this horse for 9 months. Yes, she said simply. I want to know. Silas nodded slowly. He appreciated the directness. Pressure on his sides is the deepest trigger. That means any training method that involves lateral pressure. Ropes, surcingles, blankets, any kind of body contact on the barrel. I go to those last. I build a language with him first using just my energy and my position. Approach and retreat. Retreat is the reward. He needs to learn that when I get close, nothing bad happens, and when I back off, that means he did something right. He paused, ordering his thoughts. I also need to change his association with the pen itself. Right now, that enclosed space it's where bad things happen. It's the trailer. I need to make it somewhere that good things happen, or at least somewhere that nothing happens, which for a traumatized animal starts to feel like safety. Naomi was quiet, absorbing this with the quality of attention she gave everything. Thorough, unhurried. How long does that take? Longer than your father wants. Silas looked at the horse. Obsidian had walked closer to the gate, not dramatically, not suddenly, just quietly crossed 5 feet of pen as if he'd been thinking about it for a while and had made a small decision. But less long than forcing it. Naomi followed his gaze to where the horse now stood at the gate, watching them both from maybe 20 feet away. He moved, she said very quietly. He moved, Silas confirmed in the same quiet tone. They stood together and watched the horse watch them, and the morning got slowly lighter around them, and nobody said anything for a while, because some moments are better honored by silence than by comment. Oh, the phone call came on day 11, while Silas was at the round pen at midday. His cell phone buzzed in his shirt pocket, and he didn't look at it. He didn't pull out phones near the horse, not for any mystical reason, but for the simple practical one that sudden ringtones and glowing screens were unpredictable sensory inputs, and unpredictable was the enemy of what he was building. He let it ring to voicemail. During dinner, he listened to the message. It was a Colonel Aldrich calling from a military equine program based in Virginia. The program trained horses for ceremonial duties, honor guard, state funerals, presidential inaugurations. High-profile work, the horses visible on national television. Aldrich had gotten Silas's name from someone at the Amarillo operation, heard about his work, and was calling with a contract offer. Come to Virginia for a 6-month assignment, work with 8 horses that needed specialized conditioning. The compensation was more than Silas typically earned in a full year. He stood in the narrow hallway outside the bunkhouse bedrooms and listened to the offer twice. It was a real offer. It was serious money. It was the kind of professional recognition that didn't come often. He put his phone in his pocket and went to his room and sat on the bed in the dark for a while. The obsidian work was maybe 2 weeks in. By any reasonable estimate, he was still weeks away from the horse being safe to handle, and further still from the horse being ready for basic training. Leaving now would mean not handing off to someone else, because handing off to someone else at this stage would erase everything that had been built. It would mean effectively starting over, and whoever started over might not start the same way, and Obsidian would go back to the pen and the fear and the weight of all those failed approaches pressing down on him. Silas knew this with the certainty of someone who has learned the hard way that trust, once broken again, takes exponentially longer to rebuild. He picked up his phone and called Colonel Aldrich back. The colonel answered on the second ring, professionally warm, clearly expecting a yes. "I appreciate the offer, Colonel," Silas said. "I genuinely do. But I'm in the middle of a situation here that I can't leave. If you're able to wait until this work is complete, I'd be glad to talk further, but I can't give you a timeline that works for your needs right now." A pause on the other end. "I have to be honest with you, Mr. Mercer. This position starts in 30 days. We can't hold it indefinitely." "I understand," Silas said. "I'm sorry I can't make it work." Another pause. "Is this about the money? Because we have some flexibility on the—" "It's not about the money," Silas said. "There's a horse here that needs finishing. I'm not going to leave in the middle of it." Silence. Then, "All right." Aldrich's voice had shifted slightly. Something between puzzlement and reluctant respect. "All right, Mr. Mercer. I'll make a note that you may be available in the future. I'd appreciate that." He hung up and sat on the bed and listened to the ranch settle into its evening sounds. The cattle somewhere distant, a horse in the main barn shifting, the television from the common room. He felt, if he was being honest with himself, something that was not regret. He didn't tell Holt about the call. No reason to. It wasn't Holt's business what offers he turned down. He told Naomi a few days later, not because he needed to, but because it came up naturally, the way things do when two people have developed a habit of honest conversation. They were at the pen, mourning, Obsidian standing about 15 feet from the gate now, which was progress. "A military contract," Naomi said. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. "You turned down a military contract." "I did." "Because of this horse." "Because I'm not finished," Silas said. "There's a difference between a job being done and a job being finished. This one isn't finished." Naomi was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had a quality he hadn't heard in it before. Careful, like she was picking each word with intention. "My father's been pushing me toward a man named Gavin Rhodes," she said. "He has a big spread north of here, very established, very solvent." She paused. "My father thinks that's the most important thing in the world. Solvent, stable, known." Silas waited, sensing she was going somewhere specific. "I've been watching you for 2 weeks," she said, "and I think—" She stopped, started again. "I think there are people who do what they're supposed to do and people who do what they believe is right. And those two things aren't always the same thing." She didn't look at him when she said it. She looked at the horse. Obsidian, for his part, had moved 2 steps closer to the gate, almost close enough now that if Silas reached out his arm through the panel gap, the horse could reach him without really trying. "No," Silas said quietly. "They're not." The morning moved around them. Inside the pen, Obsidian lowered his head again, that small, slight dropping of tension, and stood very still, watching them both with eyes that had stopped showing white. 14 days in, Silas opened the round pen gate and walked inside for the first time. He didn't go to the horse. He went to the far rail, roughly opposite where Obsidian stood near the gate, and he put his back to the horse and looked at the sky, at the fence posts, at nothing in particular, making himself the least threatening configuration a human body can be in, small, sideways, turned away. Behind him, he could hear Obsidian's breathing. The horse did not move for a long time. Silas didn't either. Then he heard it, the soft, deliberate sound of hooves on packed dirt. 1 step, 2. A pause so long it might have meant the horse changed his mind, but Silas waited, perfectly still, and then 3 more steps, and then the warm, large presence of the horse was close enough that he could feel the animal's body heat on the back of his neck. He did not turn around. He didn't reach back. He didn't make a sound. He breathed slowly and let the horse stand close to the back of him, smelling his shirt, his hair, the specific scent of a specific person that a horse's nose can catalog with more precision than any human instrument. For 30 seconds, Obsidian stood right behind him, close enough to touch. Then the horse blew a long breath through his nose, the equine equivalent of an exhale, a release, a settling, and stepped sideways and lifted his head and walked calmly to the middle of the pen and stood there with his head at a natural height, not braced, not watching for threat, just standing. Silas finally turned around and looked at him. Obsidian looked back. The whites of his eyes were gone. His ears were soft, forward and relaxed, not pinned, not hard. His lower lip hung very slightly, the way a horse's lip does when the jaw is loose and the animal is not preparing for anything. The pen was quiet. Somewhere across the ranch, a crow called once and then went silent. Silas stood in that pen for 10 more minutes, moving occasionally, walking to different sections of the fence, picking up a handful of dirt and letting it fall, doing nothing in particular except being a person in the space, doing ordinary things, being ordinary. Not a threat, not a test, just a person. When he walked out and latched the gate behind him, he was careful not to let his expression do what it wanted to do. Then he walked around the corner of the feed building where nobody was watching, and he pressed his back against the wall and looked up at the sky and let himself breathe, and his throat was tight in a way that had nothing to do with sadness. 14 days. He'd been inside. The horse had let him be close. He pressed his palms flat against the rough wood of the building wall and felt it solid and real. And after a moment he pushed off and went to find something to do with his hands. The sun had moved to noon and then past noon, and the morning's achievement was becoming the afternoon's ordinary when Silas noticed, coming back from the main barn with a length of soft rope, he planned to begin desensitizing the horse too from outside the pen, slowly, just laying it on the fence rail, letting it be visible, nothing more. He noticed Naomi standing near the round pen. She had her arms crossed over her chest, not closed-off body language, but the way people stand when they're trying to hold something in, and she was watching the pen with an expression that was doing something complicated. "You went inside," she said when he was close enough. "I did." "And he let you?" "He did." She uncrossed her arms. Her hands went into her jacket pockets. "I told my father this morning that you'd be inside within the first 3 weeks." She paused. "He said he'd believe it when he saw it." "Reasonable position," Silas said. He also said he'd had a conversation with Gavin Rhodes about a dinner next Friday, the kind of dinner that has... She stopped. Her jaw set slightly. Implications. Silas set the rope carefully on the far fence rail, far enough from the pen that it was barely visible. Obsidian's ears swiveled toward it and then relaxed. The association wasn't formed yet, but it wasn't panicking either. Small things. "That's between you and your father," Silas said. "I know it is." She was quiet. She stopped again. She looked at the horse, who was doing nothing in particular in the center of his pen, just being a horse in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. "I spent 9 months watching everyone handle him wrong, knowing they were handling him wrong, writing down observations in a notebook that nobody read." She paused. "And you asked me what I'd noticed. On day 2, you just asked me like it was the natural thing to do." Silas was quiet. That shouldn't feel remarkable, Naomi said, asking a person who's been watching something what they've noticed. That shouldn't be remarkable. She looked at him. It was, though. Silas met her eyes for a moment, those gray-green eyes that saw things carefully and remembered them. You had good observations, he said. The rope, the mornings, the bilateral bruising from the transport. All of it was useful. All of it changed what I did. He paused. You shouldn't have had to wait for someone to ask. Naomi held his gaze for just a moment longer. Then she looked away, back toward the horse, and something in her face settled. Not resolved, not finished, but settled. The way ground settles after something has shifted beneath it. No, she said quietly. I shouldn't have. The afternoon stretched long and golden around them, and Obsidian stood in his pen doing nothing more alarming than being alive and intact, and the ranch went on being the ranch, and all the ordinary complicated things went on being ordinary and complicated, and somewhere in the distance a water pump that needed fixing kept not getting fixed, and the sky turned the color of old copper at its western edge, and Silas and Naomi Calder stood near a round pen and watched a horse breathe in and out in the particular way a horse breathes when it is not afraid, which was, by any measure, a different horse than the one he'd arrived to find. Not a transformed horse, not a fixed horse, not a horse that was done with its fear or done with its history, but a horse that had, for the first time in a long time, stood still and let a person be close without the world ending, which was, Silas knew, the only place any real thing ever starts. The rope stayed on the fence rail for 3 days before Silas moved it closer. That was the thing nobody watching from the outside could understand. Why 3 days for a rope on a rail? Why not 2 days? Why not 1? The answer wasn't in any training manual, and Silas couldn't have written it down in a way that would satisfy someone who needed a formula. It was in the quality of Obsidian's ear movement every time the horse's gaze crossed the fence line where the rope lay. Day 1, both ears went hard in that direction and stayed there for nearly a minute before relaxing. Day 2, 1 ear, half a minute. Day 3, a glance and then away, like a man walking past something that used to scare him and finding it smaller than he remembered. That was when Silas moved the rope 6 feet closer. He was doing this, coiling and repositioning the rope in a slow arc toward the pen. On a Thursday morning, when Torrance came around the corner of the feed building and stopped, watching. You've been messing with that rope for 3 days, Torrance said. I have, Silas agreed. He's not even reacting to it anymore. That's the point. Torrance folded his arms across his chest and watched for a moment with the expression of a man who understands the individual words, but can't make them add up to anything sensible. You know what I could do in 3 days? I know what you could try, Silas said, without heat. Torrance's jaw worked slightly. Deke says you turned down a job, something military. News traveled fast on a small operation. It always did. Silas kept his hands on the rope. I did. Why? Silas set the rope down at its new position and straightened and looked at the horse. Obsidian's ear flicked toward the rope once. Then he went back to whatever private horse business occupied his attention, standing in the light, which seemed to be enough. Because I started something here, Silas said, and I'm not done. Torrance looked at him for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. Not warmth exactly, but the particular recalibration that happens when a man realizes he may have categorized someone incorrectly. He didn't say anything. He just walked off toward the main barn, and Silas watched the rope, and Obsidian's ear did not move toward it again for the rest of the morning. That was day 17. By day 22, Silas could carry the rope inside the pen, draped over his arm, and walk the perimeter while Obsidian tracked him with calm, curious attention. No whites, no bracing. The horse would follow him with his eyes, occasionally shifting his weight to turn and keep Silas in his field of vision, and that following, that voluntary orientation, was its own kind of language. It meant the horse had decided Silas was interesting rather than dangerous. It meant the horse was making a choice. Choice was everything. You couldn't build anything real on a foundation of compliance. Silas had believed this since he was young and working for Del Pritchard in the Panhandle, watching Del spend what seemed like forever just moving around an animal, apparently doing nothing, until suddenly the animal was doing things that looked like magic, but were actually just the result of an animal that had decided to participate. "You're building a vocabulary," Naomi said one morning, watching from outside the pen as Silas moved through a slow, deliberate series of approaches and retreats with the horse. She'd been coming consistently enough now that her presence outside the pen had become part of Obsidian's known landscape. He didn't react to her anymore with any elevation in alertness. She was just a person who was there. "That's exactly what it is," Silas said, backing 3 steps away from the horse, who stood still and watched him go. Every interaction is a word. What he learns from each one is either going to support what comes next or contradict it. If I'm consistent, the vocabulary builds. He starts to understand what my movements mean, what my stillness means. He paused, watching Obsidian. Right now he knows that when I step toward him and he holds still, I step back. That's one word. Took 2 weeks to teach him that one word. And when he knows enough words? When he knows enough words, we start making sentences. Naomi was quiet for a moment, watching the horse. Then she said, without any particular setup, "Gavin came to dinner last Friday." Silas kept his attention on Obsidian. "You mentioned that was being planned. He brought wine, the good kind. Showed up in a truck that costs more than most people's houses." A pause. "My father was very pleased. What about you?" I sat at the table and answered questions about the ranch operations while Gavin told my father about his expansion plans and his breeding program and the new equipment he'd just purchased. She said it in the tone of a person recounting a medical appointment, accurately, without embellishment, without complaint. "He's not an awful person. He's just certain about everything, in the way that people are certain when they've never been in a room where their certainty was seriously questioned." Silas took 2 steps toward Obsidian. The horse's ears came forward, interested, not alarmed. He took 1 step back. The horse exhaled. Silas took another step forward. "What does your father want for you?" Silas asked. "Not what he says he wants. What does he actually want?" Naomi's answer took long enough that he had time to complete 2 more approach-retreat cycles before she spoke. "He wants me settled. He wants to stop worrying about what happens to this ranch, and to me when he's gone. He thinks Gavin represents stability, a known quantity." She paused. "He thinks my judgment about people is affected by, I don't know, sentiment, impracticality. Your judgment about this horse was right." "Yes," she said simply. "It was." That was all she said about it. Silas didn't push. He went back to his slow work with the horse, and Naomi stood at the fence and watched, and the morning went on being a morning full of ordinary weight. The trouble with working with difficult horses was the same trouble that came with most things worth doing. The progress was real, but it was too small to be visible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. From the outside, from Holt Calder's perspective, or Torrance's, or Deke's, the round pen looked largely the same as it had on day 1. There was still a horse in it. The horse was still not being ridden, still not haltered, still not doing anything that looked like training in the way most people understood training. What those people didn't see was the millimeter-by-millimeter expansion of Obsidian's tolerance for pressure, the growing steadiness of his breathing when Silas was close, the way the horse had begun, tentatively, to reach toward Silas's extended hand with his nose, not pulling away, not threatening, just investigating, making contact on his own terms. That first nose-to-palm contact happened on day 25, and Silas felt it move through him like electricity. He kept his hand still and his face still, and his breathing slow, and Obsidian held his muzzle against Silas's palm for about 4 seconds and then pulled back and snorted once, like he needed a moment to process what he'd just done. Silas took 3 steps back immediately. The retreat, the release, the reward, and the horse stood and looked at him and then looked away, relaxed, like the whole thing was nothing particularly interesting. It was, in fact, everything. That evening, Silas sat at the long table in the kitchen with a cup of cooling coffee and wrote in the small notebook he kept for training records. He didn't write about the contact itself. He wrote about what had preceded it, the specific sequence of movements over the preceding 3 days that had created the conditions for it, because that was the thing that mattered. The contact was the result. The work was the thing. Junior sat down across from him with a sandwich and looked at the notebook with the uninhibited curiosity of the young. "What are you writing?" "Notes. About the horse? About the approach sequence. What I did. What he did. What changed." Silas looked up. When you do a thing that works, you want to know how you did it, not just that you did it. Junior thought about that while he ate part of his sandwich. Deke says you could have had the horse accepting a halter by now if you'd used a chute. A chute. A narrow channel that prevented lateral movement, that forced an animal to accept contact because it had no choice. Standard equipment. Effective, in the way that effective sometimes means getting an immediate result at a long-term cost. In a chute, the horse would have accepted the halter because it had no other option, Silas said. That's not the same as the horse accepting the halter. In a chute, I'm not teaching him to trust me. I'm teaching him that his options are gone and resistance is pointless. He closed the notebook. And the moment he's out of the chute, everything he learned in it evaporates. Because what he learned was about the chute, not about me. Junior chewed thoughtfully. So the slow way is actually the fast way. For this horse. For what this horse needs to become. A breeding stallion around people, handled regularly, over years. Yeah. The slow way is the only way that sticks. Junior nodded slowly. He looked like he was filing this somewhere. Then he finished his sandwich and took his plate to the sink and went off to wherever young ranch hands went in the evenings. And Silas sat with his cold coffee and thought about what came next. What came next was the blanket. Getting a horse that had been traumatized by bilateral pressure to accept a blanket was a specific kind of patience exercise that required Silas to spend 4 full days just introducing the folded blanket as an object in Obsidian's environment. He set it on the fence. He carried it while moving around the pen. He set it on the ground near the horse's feet and stood back and let the horse investigate it with his nose, which Obsidian did with the particular focused caution of an animal that has decided intellectual curiosity might be compatible with physical wariness. On the 3rd day, Obsidian picked up the corner of the folded blanket with his teeth and shook it once, experimentally, as if checking whether it would do anything surprising. When it didn't, he dropped it and walked away with the air of an animal that has verified a hypothesis and moved on. Silas stood in the middle of the pen with his hands in his pockets and tried not to laugh, because laughing was a sudden sound and sudden sounds were still, at this stage, not ideal. But something happened in his chest that was close to laughing, warm and loose. Naomi was at the fence. She'd seen it. She had both hands over her mouth and her eyes were bright. When Silas came out of the pen, she said, in a careful, controlled voice, "He bit the blanket." "He investigated it," Silas said, with great professional dignity. "He picked it up and shook it. He confirmed it was not a threat." She dropped her hands and the smile came through completely, and it changed her face in a way that Silas noticed, and then carefully did not keep noticing. "You should have seen your face," she said. "My face was neutral." "Your face was not neutral." He latched the pen gate and went to get his rope from the rail, and behind him he could hear her still smiling, even though she'd stopped making the sound of it, and the morning felt, briefly, lighter than mornings at Blackridge Ranch usually did. The lightness didn't last. It rarely did. Holt Calder called Silas into the main house on a Thursday evening at the end of week 4. This was unusual. Silas had seen the ranch owner in passing, had given him brief progress reports when asked, but had not been formally summoned. He went to the house and sat in the front room, which was furnished in the particular way of ranch houses that had been occupied for decades without significant decorating intervention. Good, solid furniture that was no longer new, a rug that had been expensive once, photographs on the walls that had yellowed slightly in their frames. Holt sat across from him in a straight-back chair with a glass of whiskey he was not yet drinking, just holding. "I need a timeline," Holt said. "I understand that." "I don't think you do." Holt set the glass on the side table and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. He wasn't angry. He was tired in the way that people get when something they've put a lot into keeps not resolving. "I've got 3 breeding contracts that I've been delaying. 2 of those clients are being patient. One of them, a man named Bressler, out of Colorado, has already told his attorney to draft something. If I don't have a delivery date on those contracts by the end of this month, I'm in breach. And if I'm in breach with Bressler, the other 2 hear about it within a week." Silas was quiet, thinking through it. "What's the end-of-month date?" 11 days. 11 days. Silas did the calculation internally, honestly, without the optimism that he knew Holt wanted to hear. "I can't tell you he'll be ready to work with mares in 11 days. That's not where we are." "What can you tell me?" I can tell you that in 11 days he'll be fully halter broke if nothing sets us back. He'll be handleable. I can tell you he'll be able to have a health assessment done without risk to the vet. Whether he's ready for what breeding work actually requires, the proximity to other animals, the controlled environment, the handling during the actual process, that's further. I'm not going to put a number on that until I know how the halter work goes. Holt picked up the whiskey, drank a small amount, set it back. Bressler wants to bring a mare here in 2 weeks. That's too soon. Too soon, Holt repeated the words in a flat voice. I've got $400,000 standing in a pen and eating my grain, and I'm being told it's too soon. I know what you've got invested, Silas said. He kept his voice even. And that investment is exactly the reason not to rush this. If you push Obsidian into a breeding situation before he's settled, and he hurts a mare or he hurts a handler, you've got a liability situation on top of an unhappy client. If he hurts himself trying to get away from something he's not ready for, you've got a vet emergency with an uninsured animal in a compromised state. He paused. I'm trying to protect your investment, Mr. Calder. That means telling you the truth when the truth isn't what you want to hear. Holt looked at him for a long time without speaking. His face was doing the complex internal work of a man who is being told something reasonable that conflicts with something urgent. You have 11 days to get me something I can show, he said finally. A haltered horse. A horse that can be led. Something my clients can see on a video call that doesn't look like we're housing a liability. He stood, and that was the end of the meeting. I'll deal with Bressler. Silas walked back to the bunkhouse in the dark and stood outside for a moment before going in, looking up at the sky where the stars over the Oklahoma plains were the particular dense abundance you only get when you're far enough from city light that the sky reasserts what it's always been. 11 days. He could do it. Probably. If nothing went wrong. If. He went inside and lay on his bed and stared at the ceiling and ran through sequences in his head. What had worked? What the next steps were? Where the vulnerabilities were? His mind did this without his asking it to. It was just how he was built. This particular kind of focused problem solving that kept him company in the dark hours on ranches far from anywhere he'd ever called home. Far from anywhere he'd ever called home. He turned that thought over, noticing it, because it wasn't a thought he usually had. He'd spent 15 years moving between operations, staying until the work was done, and leaving. It was a clean life in its way. No entanglements, no roots that had to get pulled up. He had a storage unit in Amarillo with some furniture he'd stopped carrying from place to place years ago, and a post office box at the same address where important mail went, and a truck that he maintained carefully because it was the only stationary thing in his life that was entirely his. He'd never thought about this arrangement with dissatisfaction. It was just the shape his life had taken. Lying in the narrow bunkhouse bed with the Oklahoma night coming through the gap in the window, he kept cracked for air. He turned the thought over again and found something different in it than he expected. He pushed the thought away and went to sleep. The next morning, he was at the round pen before light. He did not tell Naomi about the timeline conversation. She showed up at her usual time, coffee in both hands, and he was already inside the pen with the halter looped over his arm. Not on the horse, not yet, just present, a new object in obsidian space that the horse could investigate at whatever pace suited him. Naomi looked at the halter and then at Silas. Earlier than I expected. Timeline moved, Silas said. She understood immediately. He could see it. She didn't ask who had delivered the news. How early? 11 days for something halter broke and leadable. She was quiet, doing her own calculation. Is that possible? I think so. We've been doing the groundwork. He knows my energy. He knows what approach and retreat mean. He's not afraid of contact. He paused. But a halter's different. It's the first thing that goes on a horse and means constraint. His whole body's been sensitized to constraint. Naomi set her coffee mug on the fence rail and looked at the horse. Obsidian was watching the halter with his ears forward, information gathering, rather than alarmed. He approached me this week, she said. On Tuesday morning when I was at the fence. He came to the rail and put his nose on my hand. Silas looked at her. You didn't tell me. I didn't want to make it a bigger thing than it was. She met his eyes briefly. I thought it might affect how you read his progress. Silas thought about that. No, that helps me. It means his social orientation is expanding. He's extending what he's built with me to someone else he trusts. He looked at the horse. That actually gives me more confidence about the timeline. They worked through the morning in a new register. Not the patient, indefinitely long mornings of the first weeks, but something tighter. Silas moved through the halter desensitization with a deliberateness that was still unhurried in its texture, but was now organized around a specific outcome in a specific window of time. He touched the halter to Obsidian's neck, his shoulder, his face, removing it each time before the horse could decide it was something to object to. He looped it loosely over the horse's nose and removed it. He did these things dozens of times over the course of 3 hours. By the end of the morning, he could rest the halter over Obsidian's face without the horse flinching. By day 31, 2 days ahead of Holt's deadline, the halter was on. Buckled. Worn for 20 minutes while Obsidian walked around the pen with the mild, disgruntled dignity of an animal that has decided this new thing is acceptable but wants his feelings on record. Silas stood in the center of the pen and watched the horse move with the halter on, and felt something that he didn't immediately have a name for. Not triumph. Triumph was too loud for it, more like the satisfaction of a calculation that had resolved correctly, the quiet click of things adding up. Deke was at the fence when Silas came out. He hadn't said anything while Silas worked, which was itself a change from his usual commentary. He stood with his arms on the top rail and looked at Obsidian, who was exploring the pen with what appeared to be mild satisfaction, the halter sitting on his face like it had always been there. "Huh," Deke said. Silas didn't say anything. "How'd you do that without a chute?" Showed him the halter until it wasn't interesting, then put it on when it wasn't interesting. Deke chewed on that. He chewed on it for a while. "Takes longer that way." "Yes, but he's not scared of it." "No." Another long pause. "Kid gloves approach. We used to call that the soft way." He said it without contempt this time, just like he was identifying it accurately. "Old trainer I worked for said soft way horses didn't hold. Said the fear was still in there, you'd just covered it up." "Depends what you mean by soft," Silas said. "I didn't avoid pressure. I avoided pressure before he was ready for it. There's a difference." He picked up his rope from the rail. "And the fear's not covered up. It's been addressed. He's not the same horse he was 31 days ago." Deke was quiet. "No," he said finally. "He's not." He pushed off the fence and walked away, and Silas watched him go. And it wasn't an apology and it wasn't an endorsement, but it was something honest, which was what Deke had. And so Silas counted it as enough. The dinner with Gavin Rhodes happened on a Saturday night at the end of that week, and Silas knew about it only because Naomi told him Monday morning with the particular concise manner she used for things she'd processed and filed under completed rather than ongoing. "He's talking to my father about running their 2 operations together," she said. "Not a merger exactly, a partnership arrangement. Gavin's equipment, my father's land and bloodlines." She paused. "My father thinks this is an excellent idea." "What do you think?" "I think Gavin Rhodes has never in his life been told he was wrong about something important," she said. "And I think men who've never been wrong don't know how to handle it when they are." She looked at the pen where Obsidian was wearing his halter calmly for the 3rd consecutive day. "I think my father is making a business decision and calling it a decision about my future." Silas kept his eyes forward. He had no standing in this conversation, and he knew it. What Naomi did about Gavin Rhodes and her father's plans was entirely her situation to navigate. He was a horse trainer on a temporary contract. He was a horse trainer on a temporary contract who had turned down a military job to stay. He did not examine that thought too closely. "You have standing," he said, and he hadn't planned to say it. It came out before he decided to say it, the way true things sometimes do. "With your father. More than you've been given credit for. You were right about this horse. He'll see that eventually." Naomi looked at him. He could feel her looking at him even though he was still watching the horse. "Eventually," she said. "In my experience, people come around," he said. "Not always on the schedule you need, but they come around." She looked away back toward the pen. "He sees this horse getting better," she said quietly. "Every morning he comes out here and looks, and every morning there's something different, something further along." She paused. "He hasn't said anything about it to me, but I can see him calculating." "Calculating what?" "Calculating," she said, "whether the person who told him the truth about the horse has been telling the truth about other things too. She picked up her mug from the rail. He's a slow calculator, but he's not bad at math in the end. Silas thought about Holt Calder, standing in the front room with his whiskey, tired and pressured and doing the best he knew how to do for an operation he'd built over decades, and a daughter he didn't know how to talk to. "No," Silas said. "I don't think he is." Obsidian moved to the gate and stood there looking at them both, his head relaxed, his ears forward, waiting, without urgency, without fear, just present, ready, which was a thing Silas understood, looking at the horse, and felt somewhere behind his sternum in a way he couldn't have put precise words to, though he thought about it, standing there in the thin late morning light for longer than he usually let himself think about anything that wasn't directly in front of him. Gavin Rhodes came to Blackridge Ranch on a Wednesday afternoon, which was not a day anyone had been told to expect him. Silas was in the middle of a leading session with Obsidian, the horse moving off the halter now with reasonable consistency, still needing patient handling, still having moments where something in his environment would snag his attention and he'd stop and brace, and Silas would have to wade him through it rather than push, when he heard the unfamiliar truck come down the gravel drive. The sound registered at the edge of his awareness, and he filed it away and kept his focus on the horse, on the specific quality of tension in the lead rope and what it was telling him. It was Junior who came to find him an hour later while Silas was cooling down after the session, sitting on the fence rail with water. "Mr. Rhodes is up at the house," Junior said, with the studied neutrality of someone who has an opinion about this and has decided not to share it. "He here to see the horse?" "He's here to see Mr. Calder, but he came around to the pen." Junior paused. He asked a lot of questions. "What kind of questions?" "About the timeline. About what's been done and what hasn't. About when the horse will be ready for breeding work." Junior looked at his boots. He seemed like he was doing math. Silas handed his water bottle to Junior and got down from the fence. "What kind of math?" Junior glanced toward the main house. "The kind that comes out to, 'This is taking too long.'" Silas had no response to that, because it wasn't wrong as an observation. It was taking long by any conventional standard. And he had no standing with Gavin Rhodes, who was not his employer and was not his concern. He went to put the halter away in the tack room and wash his hands and think about the next day's work. And he told himself that whatever Gavin Rhodes thought about the timeline was Holt Calder's problem to manage. He told himself that with reasonable conviction. He didn't entirely believe it. Gavin Rhodes was not what Silas had built in his head from Naomi's description, and he recognized that the mental image he'd constructed said more about him than it did about Gavin. The man was not cartoonishly arrogant. He was in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered and presentable, with the easy confidence of someone who has been successful long enough that success feels like his natural state rather than something earned. He shook Silas's hand that evening when Holt introduced them before dinner. Silas had been asked to join at the main house, which was unusual enough to feel deliberate, and his grip was firm and his eye contact was direct, and nothing about him was overtly objectionable. "You're the trainer," Gavin said. Not dismissive, assessing. "I am. Holt tells me you've got the horse taking a halter. Wearing it well, leading reasonably. We're in the early stages of groundwork." Gavin nodded, the nod of a man processing data. "I've worked with a trainer out of Colorado. Mick Farrow, you know him? He's done some remarkable things with problem horses and compressed timelines. Results-oriented approach." Silas knew Mick Farrow's reputation. "I know his work. Good results." "Some good results," Silas said, and left it there. Dinner was in the Calder dining room, which was seldom used and felt like it. The chairs didn't match the table, and the overhead light was too bright. Naomi sat across from Gavin and next to her father, and she was wearing a collared shirt that was slightly more deliberate than her usual ranch clothes, which told Silas that she'd known about the dinner and had made a concession to the occasion without making a large one. She ate and answered questions when asked, and offered nothing she wasn't asked for, which was a careful, practiced efficiency that Silas recognized as something she'd developed over a long time at tables where her contributions had variable welcome. Gavin was a capable conversationalist. He talked about cattle prices, about the challenges of the current land market in their part of Oklahoma, about a breeding program he was expanding that had already shown strong results. He talked with the inclusive ease of a man who understood that getting people to agree with you started with making them comfortable. Holt was visibly relaxed in a way he rarely was. The ease of a man who sees his concerns being addressed by someone he's decided is credible. The partnership arrangement, Gavin said, at some point between the main course and what passed for dessert, would be structured in a way that protects both operations. Your land and bloodlines, my equipment and operational capital. Neither of us gives up independence. We just leverage each other's strengths. He looked at Holt. And as the operations grow together, the personal arrangement between the families makes that partnership more coherent. The personal arrangement between the families. Silas looked at his plate. Naomi looked at her plate too. He could see it in his peripheral vision, the slight dropping of her gaze, the careful neutrality of her expression. The horse will be a cornerstone, Gavin continued. Once Mercer gets him properly sorted, Obsidian's bloodline alone puts this operation in a different tier. That's what we're building toward. He said it as though the horse were a resource in a plan he'd already finalized, a line item in a document he'd already drafted. He's not fully sorted yet, Silas said. Gavin looked at him, polite, patient. I understand, but there's a reasonable expectation of when that happens. There's a timeline I've given Mr. Calder. It's what I can honestly commit to. And beyond that timeline, I don't set goals beyond what I can commit to, honestly. Something moved behind Gavin's eyes, just a brief thing, gone before it fully formed. A conservative approach. An accurate one. Holt glanced between them with the expression of a man watching two weather systems he hopes won't intersect. Naomi reached across the table for the water pitcher and refilled her glass, and her hand was steady. And she didn't look at Silas, and Silas did not look at her. And the rest of dinner proceeded without anything else being said that mattered, which was sometimes how dinners worked. Walking back to the bunkhouse alone in the dark, Silas listened to the ranch sounds and thought about the quality of Gavin Rhodes's interest in Obsidian. It was not the interest of a horseman. It was the interest of a man who understood assets. That wasn't necessarily wrong. Obsidian was an asset, and assets had legitimate claims on people's attention. But there was a particular kind of danger in viewing an animal's recovery as a timeline problem to be optimized, rather than a biological process with its own requirements. He thought about Junior saying, he seemed like he was doing math. He thought about what math might look like from Gavin Rhodes's perspective. A horse that was taking too long to be useful, a trainer who was conservative about timelines, a process that was costing money and patience that could be shortened with a different approach. He thought, he's not going to leave this alone. He thought it clearly, with the particular certainty of knowing something before it happens. And then, because there was nothing to do with the knowledge right now, he went to bed. The situation shifted 4 days later, on a Sunday morning. Silas was not at the round pen. He was in the main barn replacing a piece of tack that had been rubbing wrong and needed adjusting, working at the bench at the back of the barn with the particular absorbed focus of someone doing a physical task that doesn't require much thought. The barn was quiet at that hour. The other hands weren't in yet, the morning chores not started. What reached him first was the sound. Not a loud sound, initially, a change in the air, a shift in the quality of the morning that was more felt than heard, a horse making the specific vocalizations that horses make when something is very wrong, a sound that carried even across the distance between the barn and the east yard. Silas was moving before he'd consciously decided to move. He came around the corner of the east barn at a pace that was below running, but only barely, and what he saw stopped him for a half-second that felt much longer. Gavin Rhodes was inside the round pen. He'd gone in with a flag, a training flag, a long stick with a small plastic bag on the end that made noise when moved, a standard desensitization tool when used correctly. When used incorrectly, when used on an animal that was not prepared for it and had a specific documented traumatic association with sudden movement in his peripheral vision, it was something else entirely. Obsidian was at the far end of the pen, and he was not the horse that had been wearing a halter calmly, not the horse that had touched his nose to Silas's palm, not the horse that had stood and watched the morning with relaxed ears. He was the horse that had put Cutter in the hospital. He was pressed into the corner of the panels with his hindquarters, his head high, his neck braced, and the whites of his eyes were back, fully back. The thin rim of white that Silas had spent weeks dissolving returned in full, and then more. His whole eye seemed white. The darkness of the iris overwhelmed by the sclera of an animal whose nervous system had just blown every circuit it had spent a month carefully rebuilding. Gavin was not panicking. That was the dangerous part. He was moving the flag in a slow, deliberate arc, the way someone does when they believe the theory of pressure and release, and have never understood that timing is everything, and this is the wrong timing for everything, and he was saying something low and controlled that Silas couldn't hear. What he could hear was the horse. Obsidian screamed. That was the word for it. Not whinny, not neigh. A horse scream. A sound that goes back to before horses were domesticated, before they had anything to do with human beings. A sound from the part of the brain that is nothing but flight or die. He launched himself off the corner panel with a force that shook the steel, and he came across the pen in a movement that was not controlled and not directed, and was essentially 1,000 pounds of terror looking for any direction that was not here. Gavin stumbled backward. The flag went up involuntarily, and the plastic bag crackled, and that sound, that specific sound, hit Obsidian like a physical impact. He spun, lost his footing on the churned dirt, went to his knees and came back up, and he hit the pen panel with his shoulder hard enough that the panel screamed on its posts. Silas had the gate latch in his hand. He did not open it. He stood at the gate with his hand on the latch, and he made himself stop, made himself look, made himself assess before acting, because opening that gate right now, bringing another person into that pen while the horse was in full panic, was how people got killed. The gate stayed latched while he read the situation in the 2 seconds he had. Gavin was on his feet, pressed against the far panel, not injured, keeping the flag low now, not moving. The horse was at the center of the pen and spinning, not charging, just spinning. The spin of an animal that can't find an exit. The spin was important. A charging horse is a different problem. A spinning horse is an animal looking for somewhere safe to go. Silas made a decision. He opened the gate and stepped inside. He did not run. He did not shout. He did not make himself large. He stepped through the gate and he stopped and he dropped his chin to his chest and he breathed, slow and deliberate, making his body the opposite of every alarming thing in the pen, and he put his hands loose at his sides and he waited. Obsidian's spin slowed. 1 revolution, 2. His eyes were still white-rimmed, but the quality of his movement had changed by some fraction. Not calm, not anywhere near calm, but the spin slowing meant the animal's brain was processing something new, something that wasn't the same frequency as the threat. "Get out of the pen," Silas said to Gavin. His voice was low and level and did not rise. He did not look at Gavin. He kept his eyes on the horse. Slowly. No sudden movements. Gate is behind you and to your left. Go now. Gavin moved. To his credit, he moved carefully. He understood enough to know that sudden movement was wrong, even if he hadn't understood anything else about what he'd just done. He worked his way to the gate and through it, and Silas heard it latch behind him, and he was alone in the pen with the horse. Obsidian had stopped spinning. He was standing at the far end of the pen, breathing hard, flanks heaving, every muscle visibly engaged with the business of surviving something. Silas could see the horse's nostrils working, reading the air, the ancient data gathering of a prey animal sorting friend from foe by scent when vision and hearing had been overwhelmed. Silas stayed where he was. He did not take a step toward the horse. He did not take a step back. He stood in the middle of the pen and breathed and let time pass, and let the air carry what it carried, and let the horse sort through it. 40 seconds. Obsidian's ears, which had been flat and hard, moved. One of them, the left, came forward. Just slightly, just the top third of it, rotating forward like an antenna being repositioned. Silas exhaled through his nose, slow. The horse's head dropped a fraction. A centimeter. Less than that. Silas sat down. He lowered himself to the ground and sat cross-legged in the dirt in the middle of the pen, making himself the smallest, lowest, least threatening configuration of a human body that exists, and he put his palms on his knees and looked at the ground. He could hear Gavin outside the pen. He could hear Holt's voice, which meant Holt had been somewhere nearby when it happened or had been found fast. He could hear Naomi's voice, and he could hear, even at low volume, even at a distance, the particular frequency of her voice saying something with a controlled sharpness that suggested she was making a large effort not to be loud about it. He let all of that stay outside. Inside the pen, Obsidian took 2 steps toward him. Stopped. Processed. Took 2 more. Silas did not move. The horse came to him in stages. each stage preceded by a pause that was the horse deciding whether to continue. And each time Silas waited and gave the horse the decision and did not rush it and did not respond to the voices outside the pen or the urgency he could feel in the air beyond the panels. When Obsidian stopped directly in front of him, close enough that Silas, if he looked straight up, would be looking at the underside of the horse's jaw. Silas turned his palms up on his knees. The horse put his nose in Silas's left palm. He held it there for longer than he'd ever held any contact before. Not 4 seconds. Longer. Long enough that Silas felt the horse's breath warm and damp against his palm, felt the specific weight of it, the pressure of a large animal choosing to make contact rather than having it imposed on him. Silas's throat was tight in a way that had nothing to do with anything he'd name out loud. Then the horse lifted his head and stepped back and stood there looking at Silas with something that was exhausted and wary and still present, and Silas slowly got to his feet, dusted off his jeans, and stood looking back. He walked to the gate. He unlatched it. He walked out and closed it behind him. Holt Calder was standing 6 feet from the gate. Naomi was standing to her father's left and slightly behind him, and her face had the stark, stripped quality of someone who has just watched something frightening and is still processing it, and is also, underneath that, furious. Gavin Rhodes was standing to Holt's right with the flag held at his side, and an expression that was doing the difficult work of appearing calm while being aware that he had miscalculated something seriously. Nobody said anything for a moment. Silas looked at Gavin. He'd said a lot of careful, measured things since coming to Blackridge Ranch, and he'd bitten back a lot of others, and the habit of professional restraint was strong in him. But he looked at Gavin Rhodes with the flag hanging from his hand and the horse he'd spent 35 days rebuilding still trembling at the far end of the pen, and he said what he said. "You had no business in that pen." Gavin's jaw tightened. "I've been working horses for that horse," Silas said. "You had no business in that pen with that horse without my knowledge and without any understanding of what his specific trauma history requires." He paused. "You could have gotten yourself killed. You could have gotten the horse killed. You could have undone months of work." He looked at Holt. "Who let him in?" Holt said nothing. That was itself an answer. Naomi made a small sound. Not a word, just a sharp exhale, the kind that contains a complete sentence. "I thought a fresh approach was worth trying," Gavin said. His tone had a defensive edge that was working hard to sound like calm authority. "The horse has been in this pen for over a month, and I've seen the slow walk approach. I wanted to see what a more direct—" "You wanted to prove something," Silas said. "And you did it with someone else's animal, on someone else's property, with someone else's months of work on the line." He was not yelling. He had never been a man who yelled when he was truly serious. His voice was completely level, and that was, he understood, possibly more unsettling than volume. "I need you to stay away from this pen. I need that to be an absolute condition going forward, or I'm done here." Silence. Holt looked between Silas and Gavin with an expression that was calculating in real time. The expression of a man rebalancing accounts he thought he had settled. "Holt," Gavin said. His voice had shifted. The social ease was gone, replaced by something more direct, more accustomed to getting its way. "The trainer has a right to his methods, but this operation has a financial reality that—" "Gavin!" Naomi's voice was quiet and cut right through him. Gavin stopped. Everyone looked at her, including Silas, and she was not looking at Gavin, and she was not looking at her father. She was looking at the pen where Obsidian stood against the far rail, breathing hard, the whites of his eyes still visible. "That horse," she said, "was going to be a breeding stallion this spring." Her voice was steady in the way that things are steady when a great deal of effort is being applied to making them so. "He couldn't be touched. He'd hurt 2 people. Every person on this ranch, including my father, had decided that the only options left were force or loss." She paused. "I told my father for 9 months what I thought was wrong with how he was being handled. Nobody listened." She looked at her father now, and her eyes were clear and direct, and there was nothing soft in them. "You went in there today, and in 10 minutes you nearly destroyed everything that man has built in 5 weeks. And you went in because you thought you knew better." She paused. "With all due respect, Gavin, you did not know better. And you should have known you didn't know better, and you went in anyway." Gavin looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face. surprise, and beneath that, the particular discomfort of a man who is used to having his authority respected by everyone in a room and has just discovered it doesn't reach as far as he thought. "Naomi," her father said, and his voice had a warning in it that was habit rather than conviction. "Dad." She looked at him. He was in that pen for 7 weeks before Silas could go in. 7 weeks. And it took 5 more weeks to get the horse calm enough for groundwork. She looked at Gavin. He went in this morning with a flag. A flag. With a horse whose documented trauma response is to lateral movement in his peripheral vision. She stopped, took a breath. "I documented that. I told you, she said to her father. And the word, you had a weight in it that was not about the horse at all. Holt Calder looked at his daughter. Silas had never seen Holt look at Naomi in quite that way. Not with warmth. The man wasn't built for easy warmth in public. Silas had understood that about him early. But with something else. The look of someone who has been handed information that is changing the shape of a picture he thought he had memorized. Gavin recovered. He was good at recovering. It was part of what made him effective in most situations. The intent was not, "I understand I misjudged the situation. I can acknowledge that." He looked at Silas. "And I'll defer to your process going forward." He said it gracefully. It was a graceful statement. Silas believed roughly half of it. "Appreciate that," Silas said. Gavin looked at Holt, and something passed between them that Silas wasn't privy to. Then Gavin looked at Naomi, and she held his gaze with the same steady clarity she'd had throughout. And eventually he looked away first. He left about 40 minutes later. Silas watched him go from the fence by the east barn, watch the expensive truck back out, and turn and head down the gravel drive, and the dust it raised settled slowly in the still air. Junior appeared beside him. "Hell of a morning," Junior said. "Yes," Silas agreed. "She really told him." "She did." Junior was quiet for a moment. "She's been right about that horse from the start, hasn't she? Since before any of us." Silas looked at the round pen where Obsidian was starting to come down from the morning, his head lower now, his breathing slower, not the horse he'd been at 8 o'clock, but not entirely the horse he'd been at 7 either. Some ground had been lost. It would cost days, not weeks to recover, but it would cost something. "Since before any of us," Silas confirmed. He spent the afternoon in and near the pen, not working the horse. The horse was done being worked today, had earned the right to just stand and be left alone after what his nervous system had gone through, but just present. Sitting on the sawhorse in the position he'd started from on day 1, at the same distance, letting the day wind down around them both. Naomi came back at 4 o'clock. She didn't say much. She sat near the fence, and they were quiet together, and Obsidian drifted toward them slowly over the course of an hour until he was standing at the gate rail, close. Just being near people he had decided, over weeks of evidence, were safe. "Your father came out here after Gavin left," Silas said, not a question. He'd seen it from a distance. "He stood at the fence for about 10 minutes and looked at the horse," Naomi said. "He didn't say anything to me." A pause. "He's calculating again." "Yeah," Silas said. "I think the math is coming out different this time." Naomi was quiet for a while. "You sat down in the pen," she said eventually, "when he was panicking. You sat down in the dirt in the middle of a 1,000-pound animal in full terror, and you just sat there. It was the right move." "I know it was." She looked at him. "I was watching. I saw why." A pause. "I was also scared for you." Silas looked at her. The afternoon light was the long gold kind that happened in the last hour before sunset on the plains, the kind that was indiscriminate about what it made beautiful, landing on fence posts and water troughs and people alike. "I was fine," he said. "I know you were fine. You're fine now." She held his eyes for a moment. "I was still scared." He held her gaze and didn't deflect it, and didn't make it smaller than it was. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm sorry you had to watch it." She looked away, back toward the pen, and Obsidian was there at the gate rail, watching them both with eyes that had finally, over the course of the long afternoon, come back to their normal darkness. No white. Just the steady, dark, present attention of an animal that had been through something hard today and had nonetheless found his way back to the people he trusted. Which was, Silas thought, something. Which was, honestly, more than something. He sat on the old sawhorse in the fading light of a Sunday in Oklahoma and looked at the horse that had cost him 6 weeks and a military contract, and a measure of peace he hadn't known was gone until it started coming back. And he thought about what Naomi had said. "I was scared for you." And he thought about the way it had landed, not like an intrusion, but like something fitting into a space that had been there, waiting, without him realizing it had a shape. He thought about the storage unit in Amarillo, the post office box, the truck maintained carefully because it was the only thing fully his. He thought about those things, and then he set them aside, because the horse was looking at him and the evening was coming down. And for once in his life, the thing directly in front of him was enough. The days after the incident with Gavin had a different texture to them. Not quieter exactly. The ranch made its usual sounds, the hands did their usual work, the cattle didn't adjust their schedule for anyone's emotional weather. But something had shifted in the atmosphere of the place, the way air changes after a storm has moved through. Not clean, not resolved, but different from what it had been before. Holt Calder became a man who watched more and spoke less, which was notable because he had never been a particularly talkative man to begin with. Silas would see him at the fence near the round pen in the early mornings, not close, not interfering, just standing at a distance with his coffee and observing. He never commented on what he saw. He never offered opinions about the pace or the method. He just watched and then went back to his day, and Silas let him watch without acknowledgement because that was the form of respect the situation seemed to require. The work with Obsidian was genuine in its costs that week. The morning with the flag had not erased everything. Silas had been honest with himself about his fear of that, the fear of showing up the next morning to find the horse back behind his eyes, back in the place he'd been on day one. That hadn't happened. But what had happened was a kind of regression in specific areas that Silas had to address methodically and without frustration, because frustration was the enemy of this kind of work and he knew it. The horse was fine with Silas's approach and retreat. He was fine with the halter, mostly. What had regressed was his tolerance for anything entering the pen with him, any object, any change in the environment. The flag had reactivated something deep and specific, and for 4 days after the incident, Silas couldn't bring a simple training flag anywhere near the pen without Obsidian's ears going flat and his body going rigid in that particular preparatory way that was the first step toward the kind of panic that had happened Sunday morning. So they went back to fundamentals. Not all the way back. Not to the sawhorse at 30 feet of day one, but back to the version of trust that existed before the setback. And they rebuilt from there the same way they'd built the first time. Through repetition, through consistency, through the accumulated evidence of days on days of nothing bad happening. Deke watched Silas work one afternoon and didn't say anything disparaging, which was its own form of progress. "How long to get back to where you were?" he asked, leaning on the fence. Not combative. Few days for the acute stuff. A week for it to be solid again. Silas was inside the pen, standing near Obsidian with a short training stick held loosely at his side. Not the flag, just the stick, working the horse back up to tolerating handled objects near him. Trauma responses don't follow a linear schedule. They respond to accumulated positive experience, and they regress when something reactivates the original event. You don't go back to zero, but you go back. Deke was quiet for a moment. "The day it happened. When you went in and sat down in the dirt." He paused. "That was either real brave or real stupid." "Probably some of both," Silas said honestly. Deke made a sound that was as close to a laugh as Silas had heard from him. "Yeah," he said. "Probably." He pushed off the fence and went back to work, and that was the closest thing to an endorsement Silas ever received from him, and he counted it accordingly. The conversation with Holt came on a Thursday evening, 8 days after the incident with Gavin. Silas had not been summoned this time. He was walking back from the pen at dusk when Holt fell in to step beside him. Not casually, Holt didn't do casual, but with the deliberateness of a man who had decided to have a conversation and was having it on his own terms. They walked for a bit without speaking, past the main barn and the paddock where the quarter horses were settling for the night. "Gavin called me Tuesday," Holt said. "All right," Silas said. "The partnership arrangement. He's withdrawing the offer." A pause. He said it was about operational differences. His term, which is a polished way of saying he didn't appreciate being told he was wrong in front of people. Silas said nothing. The personal dimension of the arrangement is also, he indicated he'd pursue other opportunities. Holt's voice was neutral on the words, the careful neutrality of a man relaying information while deciding what he thinks of it. Which I take to mean he and Naomi's situation is finished before it properly started. I see, Silas said. She doesn't know yet. I haven't told her. He paused. I'm not sure she'll be unhappy about it. That's between you and her, Silas said. Yes. Holt stopped walking. They were near the old hitching post by the gravel lot where Silas's truck still sat in more or less the same spot he'd parked it on arrival, which felt like a long time ago now. It is. He was quiet for a moment, a long one, in the way of men who have organized what they want to say, but find the organizing was easier than the saying. I owe my daughter an apology, Holt said. He said it the way he might say a fence needed replacing, acknowledging a structural reality without ornamenting it. I've owed it for a while, longer than this horse has been on this property. Silas waited. She knew what was wrong with how we were handling him. She knew it early and she documented it, and she brought it to me more than once. He looked at the round pen, visible at the far end of the yard, catching the last of the evening light. I dismissed her, not because her observations were wrong, because I was in the habit of dismissing her observations, and habit is a hard thing to examine when it's your own. He stopped. I dismissed a lot of things she told me, about the ranch, about people, about what she wanted and didn't want. He looked at Silas. She was right about more of it than I gave her credit for. It was the most Holt Calder had said at once in Silas's presence, and it cost him something to say it. You could see that in the way his jaw worked and then settled, the way he was watching the middle distance rather than looking directly at Silas. She's a capable person, Silas said, more than capable. I know that, Holt said. I've known it. He stopped. I've got patterns with her that come from her being my daughter in a way that stopped matching who she actually is about 20 years ago. He shook his head slightly. Her mother used to tell me that. I didn't take it well. Silas thought about Naomi at the pen every morning, thought about the notebook full of horse observations that no one had asked to read, thought about the way she delivered information with the particular brevity of someone who had learned not to take up too much conversational space because taking up space had historically cost her something. Tell her, Silas said, not me. Holt looked at him for a moment, and something in his expression acknowledged the accuracy of that. Yeah, he said. I know. He looked back toward the pen. Is the horse going to be all right after what happened? He's going to be all right, Silas said. He's already mostly back. By end of next week, he'll be past it. He paused. He's tougher than he looks. Or not tougher. More resilient. Toughness and resilience aren't the same thing. Holt looked at him. What's the difference? Toughness is resistance. Doesn't bend, doesn't flex, works until it breaks. Silas considered it. Resilience is, it takes the impact and returns to shape. That horse has been through things that would have broken an animal without his kind of character. He keeps coming back. He looked at the pen. He came back from what Gavin did in 4 days. That's not nothing. Holt was quiet. What you're describing, he said slowly, sounds like it applies to more than the horse. Most things about horses apply to more than the horse, Silas said. Holt made a sound that might have been the beginning of a real laugh before he stopped it. He put his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the evening for a moment. You're not what I expected, he said, not as a compliment exactly, more like an honest accounting. When I hired you, I expected somebody. Technical. Somebody with a system. I have a system. You have a philosophy, Holt said. That's different. He started walking back toward the house. For what it's worth, he said without turning around, I think the horse is lucky you're the one they sent. Silas stood by the hitching post and watched him go and felt the weight of that statement settle in him. And he thought, they didn't send me. I came. There's a difference. But he didn't say it because Holt Calder was already gone and because maybe the distinction only mattered to Silas. The conversation with Naomi happened differently than he expected, which was true of most things with Naomi. He thought it might be a deliberate thing, a specific moment, words chosen in advance. Instead, it happened the way honest things often happen between them, which was sideways and gradually and without announcement. It was a Saturday morning, 8 days before Silas had privately calculated would be the end of his contract work. Obsidian was back to where he'd been before the incident and then a little further. The setback had, in the particular perverse way of setbacks, actually cemented some of the groundwork more deeply, the way a bone that heals right is sometimes stronger at the breakpoint. The horse was leading reliably, accepting contact on his barrel and hindquarters without alarm, beginning to respond to light pressure cues that were the early building blocks of the actual training work that would follow. Following, after Silas was gone. He'd been thinking about that without directing himself to think about it, the way a tongue finds a sore tooth without being asked. Naomi was at the fence. She'd been quiet that morning, different from her usual quality of silence, which was engaged and attentive. This was the silence of someone carrying something. "My father told me about Gavin," she said eventually. Silas kept his hands on the lead rope where he was working obsidian through a basic yielding exercise, soft and repetitive. "When?" "Last night." She paused. "He told me about Gavin, and then She stopped. The sound she made wasn't quite a laugh, but it had some of the qualities of one. "He apologized to me. My father, Holt Calder, apologized." She said it like she was checking whether the words made sense in that order. "Not for Gavin specifically. For a long list of things, the horse being part of it." She paused again. "He cried a little, which I have seen my father do exactly once before in my life, at my mother's funeral." Silas glanced at her. She was looking at the horse, her expression doing several things simultaneously. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I don't know yet." She said it honestly. "I've wanted him to say those things for a long time. And now he has, and I believe him, and I also don't know what to do with it. Because wanting something and getting it aren't the same emotional experience, it turns out." "No," Silas said, "they're not." He brought obsidian through another yielding sequence, and the horse executed it cleanly, hindquarters moving off light leg pressure in a way that 6 weeks ago would have been unthinkable. Silas released the pressure immediately. The release was always the lesson, not the request. And the horse stood and blew out through his nose and licked his lips, the physiological signals of a horse processing correctly. "He asked me what I wanted," Naomi said. "My father. He asked what I wanted to do with the ranch, with my future. He said—" She stopped. "He said he'd been making plans that involved me without asking me what plans I wanted to make. He said he wanted to hear what I actually wanted." "What did you tell him?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I told him I wanted to stay on the ranch, that I've always wanted to stay, that I'm good at running it, and I know it better than anyone except him, and I have plans for the breeding program that I've been writing down for 3 years without telling anyone, because there didn't seem to be a point." She paused. "I told him I didn't want a partnership that was designed to solve his anxiety about the future by arranging my life for me." She looked at Silas. "I told him that I would know, that I'd found it already, actually, the quality of person I wanted in my life. That I would know because they'd be someone who asked me what I noticed before they decided they already knew." The morning held very still. Silas had obsidian on a loose lead, the horse standing relaxed at his shoulder, and he was looking at Naomi and she was looking at him. And the thing in the air between them wasn't complicated, but it was also not small. "Naomi," he said. "I know your contract ends in 8 days, she said. Her voice was steady and matter-of-fact, and he recognized that she'd prepared herself to be steady about this. "I know you've been moving between operations for 15 years. I know that's a life you've built, and it fits you, and I'm not—" She stopped, began again. "I'm not asking you for anything. I just wanted you to know what I said to my father, because you're part of why I was able to say it." He led Obsidian to the rail, tied him off with a quick release, and walked to the fence. He stopped about 3 feet from where Naomi was standing and leaned his forearms on the top rail. "I turned down a military contract to stay on this job," he said. "I know. That's not something I've done before. Turned down a contract to finish a job. I finished jobs and moved on. I've never..." He stopped and said it straight, the way he'd learned to say straight things because the other way was a waste of time. "I've never had a reason to think about staying somewhere when a job was done. This is the first time that's been true." Naomi looked at him, those gray-green eyes, careful and clear. "That's not the same as saying you're going to stay," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not. It's saying I want to." He held her gaze. "Which is not something I've said before. Or felt before. with any real clarity. He paused. I'm not a certain thing, Naomi. I've got 15 years of moving in a storage unit in Amarillo, and I don't know if I'm someone you build something with. I'm telling you honestly that I don't know. I know you don't know, she said. I'm not asking for certainty. What are you asking for? She looked at him for a long moment. I'm asking whether you're going to have a conversation with my father before you leave or after. Something in Silas's chest did a complicated thing. You want me to have a conversation with your father? If you're going to stay, she said, he should hear it from you first. Not because he owns me or because I need his permission. Because he's my father and he's trying to do better, and giving him that would be, she paused. It would be kind, and I think you're someone who understands the value of that, even when it's inconvenient. Silas was quiet. Outside the pen, the morning was moving into midday. A hawk was doing something patient and circling over the north pasture. In the pen, Obsidian stood at the rail with the lead rope loosely tied, and his head in a natural low position and his eyes half closed in the early warmth. A horse who was not bracing for anything. Yeah, Silas said. I understand the value of that. Naomi nodded once, looked away, looked back. Also, she said, and something had changed in her voice, something lighter coming in under the careful steadiness. You should know that I've been writing down observations about you in the same notebook where I wrote down observations about the horse. Silas looked at her. You've been keeping notes on me. Professional habit. What do the notes say? She considered for a moment. That you're patient in ways most people aren't. That you're honest even when it costs you something. That you have a tell when you're trying not to show that something matters to you, which is that you get very still. She looked directly at him. You're very still right now. He was. He was completely still, with his forearms on the fence rail, and the Oklahoma morning all around him, and this specific woman looking at him with the kind of clear, unbothered attention that saw exactly what was there and was making her own decision about it, freely, on her own terms. He felt, standing there, the particular shifting sensation of a life that had been pointing in one direction for a very long time, beginning to point somewhere different. Not a dramatic pivot, not a sudden revelation, just the quiet, certain reorientation of a compass finding north. He didn't have the language for it yet, all of it. He wasn't sure he needed it all yet. I'll talk to your father, he said. Naomi let out a slow breath. Not relief exactly, more like something that had been held carefully could now be set down. Okay, she said. Behind them, Obsidian shifted his weight and blew out through his nose, the sound of an animal that is comfortable and present and entirely without the urgent, consuming fear that had once been the only thing he knew how to feel. Silas heard it and turned to look at the horse, could not help it, the reflex of weeks of attending to every signal. And Obsidian looked back at him with those dark, steady eyes, and then looked away toward the pasture, mild and certain, like a horse who had decided the world was something he could tolerate being in. That night Silas sat at the small desk in his bunkhouse room and opened the notebook he kept for training records and wrote down the sequence of the day's work, the yielding exercises, the lateral work, the specific cues Obsidian was responding to and at what pressure level, the things that would need to be continued by whoever worked the horse in the months ahead. Then he sat with the pen in his hand and looked at the last line he'd written, and then, below it, he wrote something that was not a training note. He wrote, "Talk to Holt tomorrow." He looked at it for a long moment. Then he closed the notebook and turned off the light and lay back on the narrow bed with the Oklahoma night coming through the window crack. The same window he'd cracked on his first night here. The same sounds of cattle and darkness and a ranch full of things that needed tending. The difference was how those sounds felt now. Not like the ambient noise of a temporary place. Like something closer to the sound of somewhere he was from, or somewhere he was going toward, which might be, when you were 41 years old and had been moving long enough, the same thing. He was not a certain thing. He'd said that honestly. He had 15 years of moving in a storage unit and habits built for a life without roots. But he was still here. And tomorrow he would talk to Holt Calder. And the horse was healing, and the morning would come as mornings always did. Indifferent to what any of them needed, but arriving anyway. Full of light and the possibility of the next thing, whatever it turned out to be. He talked to Holt the next morning. Not at the round pen, not on neutral ground. He went to the main house and knocked on the door at 7:30, which was after breakfast, and before the day's work found its rhythm. The window of time when Holt was usually in the front room with coffee and the ranch account spread on the table in the organized chaos of a man who understood his numbers but resented the paperwork they required. Holt opened the door and looked at him with the expression of a man who had been half expecting this and wasn't sure how he felt about being right. "Mercer. Mr. Calder, you have a few minutes?" Holt stepped back and let him in. They sat in the front room, the one with the yellowed photographs, and the furniture that didn't quite match, and Holt poured coffee from the pot on the side table without asking whether Silas wanted any, which was the particular hospitality of men who express things through practical action rather than words. Silas held the mug and didn't drink from it immediately and said what he'd come to say without preamble, because preamble was what men used when they weren't sure they should be saying the thing, and Silas was sure. "I'd like to stay on at Blackridge when the contract work is finished," he said. "Not as a contractor on a specific job. As a permanent hire if you have the use for one. I can bring the breeding program up to what it should be. I can take on training work from other operations through the winter months to offset my cost to you. And," he stopped, said the rest of it straight, "I want you to know that I have feelings for your daughter that are serious and not passing. I'm telling you before anything further develops because that's the right way to do it. Not asking your permission, telling you so you hear it from me." Holt looked at him for a long time. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug the same way Naomi did, which was a thing Silas noticed and filed somewhere quiet. "You've been here 7 weeks, Holt said. "I have." "That's not a long time." "No," Silas agreed. "It's not. Naomi doesn't make decisions quickly," Holt said, and there was something careful in how he said it, something that was working to be fair rather than protective, which was a different thing. "She thinks things through. She's been that way since she was small. She doesn't commit to things she isn't sure about." "I know that about her," Silas said. "Then you know that if she's—" Holt stopped, looked at the window. The light through it was the clear morning kind that didn't soften anything. "If she's considering something seriously, it means something with her." "I understand that." Holt was quiet for a moment. "The horse," he said. "What you did with him. What you're still doing with him." He paused. "I owe you an honest statement. I thought you were wasting my time for the first 2 weeks. I thought the soft approach was, I thought it was something men do when they're not sure enough of themselves to be direct." "I know what you thought," Silas said. "I was wrong." He said it cleanly, without a lot of architecture around it. "I've been wrong about a few things lately. My daughter's been patient about that." He looked at Silas. "She's had to be patient about a lot of things for a long time because of me. I'm trying to be different about that going forward. It's harder than it sounds when you're 63 and the patterns are as old as she is." "I believe you," Silas said. Another silence. Holt drank his coffee. Silas drank his. "You'd need a place to live," Holt said finally. "There's the east pasture. The old frame out there is a teardown, but the land is sound. We could talk about something more. Permanent. On that ground." He said permanent like a man testing the weight of a word. "That's a conversation for later, after the season, after we see how things settle." "That's fair," Silas said. "And the breeding program. I want to see the plan you have in mind, written out. I'm not agreeing to anything I haven't read." "I'll have it to you by end of the week." Holt nodded. He looked at Silas over the rim of his mug with the assessing look that was simply his baseline expression, the look that had evaluated horses and weather and men for 6 decades. "You turned down a military contract," he said. "I did." "For the horse." "For the work," Silas said. "The horse was the work." Holt was quiet for a long moment. "That was either a very principled decision or a very foolish one," he said. "Probably some of both," Silas said. It was what he'd said to Deke about going into the pen, about being brave or stupid, and he meant it the same way both times. He was not a man who thought the best decisions were always comfortable or logical from the outside. He just thought they were the ones you could live with afterward. Holt set his mug down on the side table. He looked at Silas, and something moved through his expression that was not easy to name. Some compound of things, respect and grief, and the particular weariness of a man who has held things together alone for a long time and is starting to consider what it might mean to share the weight. "My wife would have liked you," he said. Not sentimental, just honest. Silas didn't have a response for that. He just nodded once, and they sat for a moment with the morning between them, And then both men stood up at roughly the same time and shook hands the way they had on the very first evening, firmly and without ceremony. Silas walked back to the bunkhouse and sat on the edge of his bed and exhaled for what felt like the first time in a while. Then he got up and went to work. The final stage of Obsidian's initial training was not the dramatic thing it could have been made into. There was no single moment when the horse was suddenly, obviously different. The transformation was not an event. It was a direction, a consistent orientation toward function and away from fear that accumulated day by day until the accumulation became visible. By the end of Silas's 8th week at Blackridge, Obsidian could be haltered and led without hesitation. He could be groomed on both sides. The bilateral contact that had been the deepest trigger, the echo of a transport partition hammering into his flanks for 18 hours, without bracing or threatening. He could be walked through the barn, loaded into a small pen alongside a human handler, and moved through basic desensitization to sounds and objects, with the alert, interested attention of an animal that had decided the world was full of things worth investigating rather than things to flee. He was not finished. He was far from the fully trained breeding stallion that his bloodlines promised, and Silas said that clearly and in writing in the report he gave to Holt, because saying it clearly was the only honest option. The work ahead would take months of consistent handling, continued desensitization, eventual introduction to other horses, and eventually to breeding work in a controlled environment, gradual and sequenced and never rushed. But the animal that couldn't be touched was gone. What was in the pen now was a horse who would come to the gate when he heard Silas's voice. A horse who had, 2 weeks after the Gavin incident, extended the same gate coming to Naomi, and then, one quiet Tuesday morning, to Junior, who had stood at the rail with his palm out and his expression slightly disbelieving as Obsidian put his nose there and held it, and who had afterward gone to the far side of the equipment barn and stood there alone for a few minutes and come back with red eyes that he attributed unconvincingly to dust. Deke, on that same Tuesday, watched from 20 feet away with his arms folded and said nothing for a long time. Then he said to no one in particular, "Huh," which was, coming from Deke, equivalent to a standing ovation. Silas drove to Amarillo on a Friday in October, 6 days after the official end of his contract period, and emptied the storage unit. It took most of a morning. There wasn't as much as he'd thought. Furniture he'd stopped caring about, boxes of things that had been in storage long enough that the initial reason for keeping them had gone vague. He kept what mattered, which turned out to be less than 2 truckloads, and donated the rest and closed the account on the unit, and drove back west through the afternoon with the Oklahoma sky ahead of him doing what Oklahoma skies did in October, which was sprawl and deepen and go colors that had no reasonable name. He arrived back at Blackridge at dusk. The ranch hands' trucks were in their usual places. The main barn had its lights on. The round pen was empty, which was increasingly the case. Obsidian had graduated to a larger paddock adjacent to the east barn. More space, more stimulation, more of a horse's natural environment and less of the small constrained enclosure that had been both his prison and eventually his rehabilitation space. Silas sat in his truck for a moment after he killed the engine. The storage unit key was in his jacket pocket and he pulled it out and looked at it. Just a small metal key on a plain ring, the kind that opened thousands of identical units in thousands of identical facilities across the country. He'd had it so long that carrying it had stopped registering as something he was doing. He set it on the truck's center console. He didn't need to keep it anymore. Naomi was at the paddock fence when he walked around the east barn. She'd seen his headlights, probably, or heard the truck. She knew the engine sound the way you know the sounds of a place you pay attention to. She was in her work jacket with her braid over one shoulder, and she was watching Obsidian, who was moving in the larger space with the loose exploratory movement of a horse that is learning a new environment and finding it satisfactory. "Amarillo," she said, when Silas came to stand beside her. "Amarillo," he confirmed. She looked at the truck. "You brought things back." "Most of what I had, yeah, some of it went to donation." She nodded, processing that. Then, "Where does it go?" "The bunkhouse for now. The east pasture, eventually, if things go the way I think they're going to go." He looked at her. "Your father and I have been talking about the frame out there, whether a new structure's worth building or whether you start from scratch." Naomi looked at the paddock, where Obsidian had stopped moving and was standing in the fading light with his ears forward, watching the distance with the calm, curious attention that was entirely new in him. Not watchful for danger, but watchful for interesting things. A fundamentally different posture. "Start from scratch," she said. "The frame's been there since the 70s, and it was cheap then." "That's what I thought, too." She turned to look at him. The dusk was coming down around them, and the light was the specific color it turned in October evenings on the plains. A color that made everything look like it was being kept, rather than just existing. "You came back," she said. Simple statement, but there was something in it that was not simple. "I came back," he said. He looked at her directly, the way he had that morning at the fence when she'd told him she'd been scared for him, the way he was learning not to deflect with her. "That's going to keep being true, Naomi. I want you to know I understand what that means. I've been someone who left for a long time, and understanding what it means to stay is, I'm still learning the shape of it, but I'm not going anywhere." She held his gaze, those gray-green eyes that saw things as they were and made their own decisions. "I know you're not," she said. "I'm not worried about that." "What are you worried about?" She thought about it genuinely, which was a thing he valued about her. She didn't give reflex answers to real questions. "I'm worried about building something," she said, "because building something means it can be damaged. It means things can go wrong that can't be fixed by starting over." She paused. "I've watched you with that horse for 2 months, and the thing I've thought the most is, you know what can be fixed and what can't. You don't pretend the line isn't there." She looked at him. "I need you to have that same honesty with me. If something's hard, you tell me. If you're struggling with something, you don't perform fine." "All right," he said. "I'm serious." "I know you are. I'm agreeing." She looked at him for another moment with the assessing quality she'd had since the first morning she'd come to the fence with her coffee. Then something in her expression settled, that particular settling, like ground after a shift. "Okay," she said. "Okay." In the paddock, Obsidian had wandered toward the fence near where they were standing. He stopped about 10 feet out and looked at them with his head at a natural level, ears forward in that calm forward position, the position that meant interested rather than alarmed. He'd developed a habit of gravitating toward where Silas and Naomi were at the fence, as if the association between the two of them and the absence of anything bad had become its own form of magnet. Naomi reached over the fence rail, and the horse came the last 10 feet and put his nose in her hand, and she held still and let him, the way Silas had taught her without ever formally teaching her, because she'd been watching long enough to understand the grammar of it. Silas watched them, the woman and the horse, and felt something that was not a small thing settle in his chest. The months that followed were not simple. Silas had been honest about that with himself from the beginning, and the honesty proved accurate. Building a life somewhere after 15 years of not building anything was not a skill you had automatically just because you'd decided to exercise it. He got things wrong. He misjudged how much Holt needed to be consulted on decisions that felt operational to Silas, but felt territorial to Holt. He underestimated how much his own habits of solitude, closing off, going quiet, processing alone when he should have been processing aloud, cost Naomi in the early months, and she told him so with the directness that was simply her nature, and he heard it because hearing hard things from people he trusted was also something he was learning. They had arguments. They had the kind of arguments that come from two people with strong, independent characters learning to share space and authority and the daily weight of a working ranch. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing that didn't get worked through, sometimes slowly, sometimes with the specific frustration of people who care about getting it right and find that getting it right is harder than they expected. Holt, for his part, underwent his own slow reckoning. He did not transform. He was still a man of few words and significant habit, still prone to making decisions on instinct and informing people afterward, still carrying the particular stubbornness of decades of running things alone. But there were differences, small and real. He asked Naomi's opinion on breeding decisions now. Not always, not yet as often as he should, but enough that the asking was becoming its own habit, slowly remaking the shape of how they worked together. He sat at the kitchen table with Silas 2 or 3 times a week and talked through the operational calendar and listened to Silas's assessments with the specific attention of a man who has decided that someone else's judgment is worth treating as data. He showed Naomi her mother's journals one evening in November, pulled them from a drawer in the bedroom that had stayed closed since the funeral, sat with her at the kitchen table while she read them. Didn't say much, just sat there, which was, from Holt Calder, a considerable thing. Obsidian's first successful breeding occurred in the spring, 7 months after Silas's arrival at Blackridge. It was not the easiest process. The controlled environment, the presence of the mare, the necessary handling during the procedure, all of it required weeks of careful preparation that Silas ran methodically, and there were 2 sessions that had to be abandoned when the horse's stress levels climbed past the threshold that Silas had established as the limit. Abort and reset rather than push and damage. Holt watched the second abort with the tight expression of a man counting money, and Silas looked at him and said, "Next week," with the flatness of someone stating a fact, and Holt nodded and walked away and didn't say what he was thinking, and the following week it went the way it was supposed to go. The mare's owner, a woman named Clara Brandt from a respected operation out of Kansas, stood at the fence afterward and watched Obsidian being led back to his paddock with the easy, unhurried movement that had become his normal gait, and she said to Holt, "He's different than I expected." "How do you mean?" Holt asked. "I'd heard about the trouble last year. I almost pulled out." She watched the horse. "He's calm. He's present. He's not waiting for something bad to happen." She paused. "That's rare in a stallion this high-strung. That's not something you train. That's something you give a horse by being trustworthy for long enough." Holt looked at Silas, who was walking the horse back to the paddock and had not heard the exchange. "Yeah," Holt said. "That's about right." By summer, the frame in the east pasture was gone, and new construction had begun on ground that had been surveyed and leveled and prepared with the particular care of something meant to last. Silas and Naomi had argued about the floor plan twice and the window placement once, and had agreed on the kitchen layout on the first try, which Naomi took as a good sign. Holt had contributed the lumber without making it a transaction, just arranged for it to show up one morning from the mill in Cutter's Bluff, and didn't bring it up afterward. Deke helped with the framing on weekends, which surprised everyone, including Deke. He showed up the first Saturday with tools and didn't explain himself, and Silas didn't ask him to, and they worked through the morning in companionable near silence, and at noon Deke said the framing was square, which meant it was good, and ate the sandwiches Naomi brought out, and came back the following weekend. Junior helped too, with the enthusiasm of someone who hadn't built anything before, and found that he liked it. Torrance helped once and spent most of it giving opinions on load-bearing wall placement that nobody had asked for, and then went back to not helping, which was the most useful thing he'd contributed to the project. The house wasn't finished by fall. Houses don't finish on schedule, especially not when they're being built by people who also have a working ranch to run, and the move-in kept getting pushed by 3 weeks, and then 2 weeks, and then 3 weeks again. Silas spent 2 months in a liminal state of half the bunkhouse and half the new structure, eating dinner most nights at the main house and going back to the bunkhouse to sleep, which was an arrangement that everyone understood was temporary and nobody made more of than it was. They married in October, a year and 3 weeks after Silas had first driven through the Iron Gate off Route 9. It was small, a courthouse in Cutter's Bluff with a justice of the peace, who was 60 years old and had clearly done this many times and still treated each one like it mattered, which Silas appreciated. Holt stood on Naomi's left, and his eyes were wet in a way he was not trying to conceal, which was new and quietly significant. Junior and Deke and Phil were there. Silas's only guest, beyond the ranch, was a man named Del Pritchard, now 72 and moving more slowly than he once had, who had driven up from the Texas Panhandle without being asked much, having been told and deciding that was sufficient reason. Del shook Silas's hand after and said, "You look different." "Different how?" Del considered. "Like somebody who's figured out where to put things down," he said. He nodded once in the direction of Naomi, who was talking to Holt with her hand in the crook of her father's arm. "She's the reason." "Part of it," Silas said honestly. "The horse was part of it too." Del laughed at that, a real laugh, the kind that goes back to knowing someone a long time. "Of course it was," he said. "Always is." The mare that Clara Brandt had brought in the spring delivered a foal in late winter, black as his sire, with the same refined head, the same strong hindquarters. Clara called it a success and brought 2 more mares the following season, and word traveled in the way that word traveled in breeding circles. Not loudly, but thoroughly. The network of people who paid serious money for serious bloodlines hearing about the Blackridge Stallion that had come back from the edge and was producing exactly what his genetics promised. 2 other operations called about training contracts in Silas's first year. A third in the second year. He took the ones that fit around the ranch work, which was the condition he'd set for himself. The ranch first, the breeding program first, the life he'd chosen ahead of the life that called from habit. There were days he missed the movement. He would not pretend otherwise. There were mornings when he'd get in his truck to drive to the feed store and feel the particular pull of the highway, the knowledge of what was beyond the next ridge and the next county, the freedom that had been the architecture of his life for a decade and a half. He felt it, and he felt it honestly, and then he'd come back to the ranch, and the work, and the woman who had made a considered decision about him, and the feeling would settle back where it lived and the day would proceed. He told Naomi about it once, the pull of the road, and she listened without alarm and said, "You should drive somewhere sometimes. Just drive. You don't have to be going to anything." He looked at her. "You sure about that?" "I'm not fragile," she said. "I'm not going to read something into you needing to move sometimes. I knew who you were when I decided." She looked back at whatever she'd been doing. "Just come back." He always did. The notebook Naomi had kept since Obsidian arrived, the one with the horse observations, the rope notes, the documentation of the bilateral bruising that nobody had asked her about until Silas had. She kept it on the desk in the room she used as an office. She'd started a second one by the time the foal arrived, and a third by the end of the second year, detailed records of the breeding program, the training assessments, the health observations on every animal on the property. Holt read the second notebook in its entirety one evening and came to dinner the next morning and said to Naomi, "The notes on the breeding schedule in the third quarter, you're right about the spacing. We've been doing it wrong for years." Naomi looked up from her coffee. "I know," she said. Holt nodded once. They looked at each other across the kitchen table, father and daughter, both of them imperfect and tired and carrying things and trying. "I know you know," he said. Which was, Silas understood, watching from across the kitchen with his own coffee, a significant sentence from that man. Obsidian was 5 years old by the time the new house in the east pasture was fully finished, furniture in place, curtains that Naomi had been specific about in the windows, the kitchen where they'd agreed it should go. He was a working breeding stallion by then, well-handled and trusted with experienced riders for light groundwork. The animal his bloodlines had always promised he could become. Not because he'd been broken into it, but because he'd been given the conditions to grow into it at his own rate. Silas would walk out to the paddock in the evening sometimes. Not for work, just because the horse was there and that was still a thing that mattered to him. Obsidian would come to the fence always, the way he'd started coming to the gate in those early weeks. Not from training exactly, not from command, but from the accumulated weight of every interaction that had told him this specific person was safe. That was the thing about trust Silas had thought more than once in the years after Blackridge stopped being a job and became the place he was from. People talked about trust like it was a feeling, like it was something you decided to have. But it wasn't a feeling, and it wasn't a decision. It was evidence. It was the sum of every small thing, every approached and retreated, every pressure released, every time someone could have pushed and chose instead to wait. You built it the same way with horses and with people and with whatever version of a life you were trying to make. Not through force, not through dominance, not through being the loudest voice or the most certain one, through showing up the same way, again and again, until the evidence became undeniable. He knew this in the particular way you know things that you didn't learn from reading, from making the mistakes that taught you, from having done it wrong and then done it differently. From watching an animal that had every reason to stay afraid choose, incrementally and on its own terms, to come back. The evenings on the plains were long in summer, and he was grateful for that. He'd stand at the paddock fence with the light going long and golden, and Obsidian's nose warm in his palm, and the sounds of the ranch behind him. Naomi's voice from the direction of the main house, Holt's answering, the particular rhythm of a place that was working and living and not finished, never finished, because places that matter don't finish. They just continue. He'd think sometimes, standing there, about the man who'd driven through that iron gate with a sore back and a thermos of coffee and 15 years of not staying anywhere behind him. He wasn't that man anymore. He was something with more friction and more weight and more specific attachment to specific ground. Something that knew where it was and had decided that knowing was better than moving. Something that had learned from a frightened horse on a Tuesday morning in Oklahoma that the hardest thing and the most necessary thing are almost always the same thing, and that the only way to earn anything real, trust, belonging, a life worth having, was to be patient enough and honest enough and present enough to deserve it. No shortcuts. No force. No pretending the process was faster than it was. Just the slow, unglamorous, quietly extraordinary work of showing up. Again and again, until it held.